Good evening and welcome back, friends. Tonight, we are going to journey through the Great Famine winter, when medieval Europe froze for 7 years. As always, let me know where in the world you are listening in from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. In the spring of 1315, a mother in northern England made an unthinkable decision. She locked her children inside their cottage, walked into the frozen wasteland, and never returned. But she wasn't abandoning them. She was saving them. Was she? Knew what all of Europe would soon discover was that the world itself was dying. The rain wouldn't stop. The cold wouldn't break. And for the next 7 years, winter would reign supreme. Her name was Marjorie of Durham, and her neighbors found her children 3 days later, alive, huddled around the last embers of their fire. The eldest, a boy of 9, clutched a note his mother had left. The priest who recorded it wrote that his hands shook as he read her words aloud. My flesh will buy them grain. My absence will grant them mercy. Tell them I walk toward God, not away from them. You see, Marjorie had understood something terrible. Something that would take the rest of Europe months to grasp. This wasn't just another harsh spring. This was the beginning of an extinction. The marketplace where she'd traded her body for bread had made the calculation clear. A living mother meant 5 mouths to feed. A missing mother meant for orphans. The church had to shelter, and the church still had grain, still had walls, still had hope that this nightmare would end. But here's what makes Marjorie's story so haunting. She wasn't unique. Parish records from 1315 show hundreds of similar disappearances. Parents vanishing into blizzards, elderly grandparents wandering into forests, always leaving notes, always locking doors from the outside, always walking toward death like it was salvation. The chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker would later write about that spring with words that feel pulled from nightmares. Rains began on St. George's Day and fell like God had forgotten how to do anything else. Not the warm rains of April that wake sleeping seeds, but frozen needles that killed whatever they touched. Crops didn't fail, they drowned standing. Rivers didn't flood, they exploded from their banks like wounded animals. Think about that. For a moment, you're a medieval peasant. Your entire world is 3 miles wide. Everything you know about survival, every technique your father taught you, every prayer your mother whispered, assumes one simple truth, that seasons follow patterns. Spring brings life. Summer brings growth. Autumn brings harvest. Winter brings rest. But what happens when spring never comes? When winter refuses to die? When the very foundation of existence cracks beneath your feet? That's what began in 1315. Not a famine, not a crisis, but the complete collapse of natural order. And Marjorie of Durham, walking into that frozen dawn, leaving her children behind to live, was just the first character in a story that would consume 15 million souls. Before it ended. The question isn't how Europe survived, it's what Europe became to survive it. Picture yourself waking up on Easter morning, 1315, in a small village outside Paris. Your neighbor Johann's jokes about yesterday's rain ruining his seedlings. His wife laughs, saying one wet spring never hurt anyone. Within 6 months, Johannes will trade his youngest daughter for a bag of moldy grain. His wife will disappear one night, and the village will pretend not to notice the fresh meat at the butcher's stall. But this morning, they're still laughing. The peculiar thing about catastrophe is how quietly it arrives. No trumpets, no divine warnings, just rain. Endless, crushing, biblical rain that began falling across Europe in May 1315 and simply didn't stop. That Easter morning in Cratzy-la-Chapelle, 20 miles from Paris, felt like any other. The baker Michel had risen at cockscrow to fire his ovens. His wife Agnes counted their silver, planning to buy young pigs at the summer fair. Their son Pierre played with wooden knights, recreating battles he'd never fight because there wouldn't be a world left to fight for. The church bells summoned them to Mass. Father Bernard, still young enough to believe suffering had meaning, delivered a sermon about resurrection, about new life, about God's promise that seed time and harvest would never cease. The congregation nodded along, comfortable in their certainty. Why wouldn't they be? Their grandfathers had survived wars. Their fathers had survived plagues. Surely they could survive a little rain. But if you'd looked carefully that morning really, Latude have seen the signs. The sparrows that usually nested in the church eaves were gone. Not dead, gone. The cats had stopped hunting, instead huddling in doorways with their fur perpetually damp. And the old women, the ones who remembered the harsh winter of 1258, had started hoarding soldat. Johans, the man who joked about his seedlings, was a cloth merchant. Successful enough to own 2 cows and rent 3 strips of land. His wife Marie had borne him 7 children, 4 still living, which made them lucky by medieval standards. Their youngest, Isabel, had just turned 6, hair like spun gold. Her father would say, worth its weight in gold, someone else would say 6 months later, weighing her against a sack of spoiled wheat. The rain that Easter was unusual only in its persistence. It had fallen for 3 days straight, turning the roads to mud, keeping the holiday merchants away. But rain in April wasn't catastrophe, it was inconvenience. The real terror wouldn't begin until May 15th, the feast of St. Dymphna, when the rain turned cold. Brother Francis of the Abbey St. Denis recorded it first. He'd been copying manuscripts when he noticed his breath misting in the scriptorium. In May, at midday, the ink froze on his quill. He thought perhaps illness had taken him. Fever turned backward into chills. Then he saw the other monks rubbing their hands, saw the frost forming on the inside of the windows. By June, that cold rain had become something medieval Europeans had no word for. We might call it freezing rain, but they called it devil spit. Water that fell as liquid but froze on contact. Entire fields became sheets of ice in summer. Roses bloomed and died in the same hour, encased in crystal tombs. The wheat, which should have been knee-high and green, stood stunted and yellow. The barley rotted in the earth before it could sprout. The rye grew, but wrong-twisted, black, infected with something that would later be recognized as ergot, the fungus that causes hallucinations and gangrene. Some villagers, desperate for any harvest, ate it anyway. They danced themselves to death in the streets, laughing as their fingers turned black and fell off. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to Johans and his family, because their story is everyone's story. By late May, Johans had stopped joking about anything. The constant rain had ruined the roads, making trade impossible. No merchants could travel, which meant no cloth could be sold, which meant no coins for bread. Not that there was bread to buy. The baker Michel had closed his ovens now. Grain meant no flour, meant no purpose to the fire. June brought the first death in Crassy-la-Chapelle. Not from starvation, not yet. Old Catherine, who'd survived 70 winters, simply gave up. She announced at Sunday Mass that God had abandoned them, walked home, lay down in her bed, and willed herself to die. The priest called it despair, a mortal sin. But privately, he envied her escape. The real horror began in July, when the rain briefly stopped. For 3 days, the sun appeared, weak and watery but present. The villagers rushed to salvage what they could, to plant anything that might grow before autumn. They worked day and night, hands bloody from tearing at the muddy earth, planting beans, turnips, anything fast-growing. On the 4th day, the hail began. Not regular hail. Chunks of ice the size of fists, driven sideways by winds that shouldn't exist in summer. They shattered shutters, killed chickens, knocked full-grown men unconscious. When it stopped, nothing remained of those desperate plantings. The fields looked like they'd been trampled by an army of giants. That's when Johannes made his first, unthinkable choice. He killed one of his cows, not for meat not, yet but for mercy. It was starving, crying constantly, too weak to stand. He told his children it had gotten sick, but Marie knew. She saw him save the blood in buckets, saw him portion it carefully with their dwindling barley. Blood pudding would keep them alive another week. Argus arrived wearing winter's clothes. Frost in the mornings, ice on the water buckets, breath misting even at noon. The second cow died on its own, and Johannes counted it lucky. They ate everything: the meat, the organs, the marrow from the bones. They boiled the hide for soup. They ground the bones for flour. Nothing was waste, because waste meant death. Brother Thomas of Westminster Abbey wrote something strange in his chronicle that summer. The heavens have forgotten how to cease their tears. At first, monks like Thomas saw it as God testing their faith. A brief punishment, maybe for the wars between England and Scotland, maybe for the French king arresting the Pope. Surely it would pass. But then came the letters from sister monasteries. From Cologne, our fields are lakes. From Florence, the Arno has swallowed 3 villages. From Krakow, the children ask what the sun looked like. What terrified Thomas wasn't the rain itself, it was the temperature. In July, the height. Of summer he could see his breath while saying morning prayers. Ice formed on the altar wine. And still the rain fell. The monastery's chronicle, which Thomas kept with meticulous care, tells us exactly when normal ended and nightmare began. June 23rd, the eve of St. John, traditionally celebrated with bonfires that burned until dawn. That year, no fire would stay lit. The rain fell horizontally, driven by winds that belonged to December, not midsummer. Thomas wrote, "The brothers attempted 7 times to light the sacred fire. Each time, the rain doused it before a single prayer could be spoken. Prior William declared it a sign of what he dared not say." Thomas had been corresponding with monasteries across Christendom for 20 years. His position as chronicler meant he received letters from abbeys in Scotland to Sicily, from Ireland to Poland. Usually, these letters discussed theological matters, requested copied manuscripts, or shared news of appointments and deaths. But starting in July 1315, Every letter carried the same message, dressed in different words. Something was terribly wrong with God's creation. From Melrose Abbey in Scotland came a letter that made Thomas's hands shake. "Brother, we write to you from hell, frozen over. It is July, yet we break ice from our wells each morning. The barley stands drowned in fields that have become swamps. Yesterday, we found a shepherd frozen to death. In July, Brother Thomas. He was young, strong, only 20 summers. We found him standing upright, eyes open, still holding his crook. The sheep around him were ice statues. Have we entered the end times? The abbot of Cluny in France sent word that would have been dismissed as madness any other year. The vine withers as if cursed. The soil rejects all seed. We have consulted. Our oldest records nothing, speaks of summer frost, of hail in August, of rain that burns like ice. Our farmers weep in the fields, beating the mud with their fists, begging it to remember its purpose. From the German monasteries came increasingly frantic reports. The prior of Reichenau wrote, "Lake Constance rises daily. Entire villages now exist only as church bells tolling beneath the waves. We ring our own bells in answer, but God remains deaf. The rain tastes of sulfur. Birds fall from the sky mid-flight, frozen solid. What sin has mankind committed to earn such wrath?" But it was a letter from an Italian monastery that contained the most chilling observation. Brother Antonio of Monte Cassino, a learned man who'd studied both scripture and natural philosophy, wrote, "This is not divine punishment. Brother Thomas, I have read the ancient texts, Greek and Roman both. This happened before. They called it the years without summer. Crops failed, empires fell, and mankind retreated to caves. We are not being punished. We are being erased." Thomas himself had begun keeping detailed records of the weather, something unprecedented for the time. His entries from July 1315 read, "Like fever dreams. July 4th, Feast of St. Ulrich. Rain for 16 straight hours. Temperature cold enough that we wore winter robes to matins. 2 brothers collapsed during prayers, their lips blue. July 11th. The rain has not ceased for 40 hours. We cannot light fires. We eat cold porridge and pray with numb fingers. Brother Matthew suggests we are experiencing Noah's flood again. Prior William had him whipped for heresy, but privately we all wonder. July 19th. Something impossible today. The rain froze as it fell, coating everything in ice. In July, the vegetable garden is destroyed. Every plant encased in crystal, beautiful and dead. We gathered to pray, but the words stuck in our throats. How do you pray when creation itself seems broken? The correspondence between monasteries became increasingly desperate as summer crawled toward autumn. They began sharing survival techniques rather than theological debates. How to keep manuscripts from molding in the constant damp. How to preserve food when nothing would dry. How to maintain faith when every prayer for sun was answered with more rain. From Prague came instructions for building underground storage that might resist the water. From Dublin came recipes for making bread from acorns and chestnuts. From Rome came silence. The Holy See had problems of its own, with the Tiber flooding the papal palace repeatedly. Thomas noted something else, something that wouldn't be fully understood for centuries. The rain wasn't uniform. It would pound. one region while barely touching another 20 miles away. But those dry spots weren't lucky, they were cursed differently. Without rain, but with temperatures below freezing in summer, crops still died, wells still froze, people still starved. A letter from the Bishop of Bergen in Norway contained an observation that haunts historians today. The merchants from Iceland have not come. They were due in May, as always. It is now August. Ships sent to investigate found the sea routes blocked by mountains of ice that should not exist in summer, or perhaps should not exist at all. The sailors speak of icebergs, tall as cathedrals, moving south like an army of frozen giants. By late August, Thomas's own entries had taken on a tone of barely controlled panic. We have begun rationing in August. The harvest is already lost, and we must survive on stores meant for winter. But what winter awaits us if summer itself has become frozen? Prior William no longer speaks of God's tests. He speaks of God's absence. The most telling entry comes from September 3rd. Brother Francis asked me today why I still write these chronicles. Who will read them? Who will survive to care about the weather of a dead year? I had no answer. I write because the act of writing means I still believe in tomorrow. When I stop writing, I stop hoping. So I write of rain, of cold, of death creeping closer. I write because someone must witness the ending of the world. Imagine watching your entire year's work, everything you need to survive, a rotting in the field before your eyes. Not failing to grow, not dying from drought, but literally dissolving into grey sludge. A French peasant named Guillaume left us. A rare written account dictated to a priest. The wheat stood tall and green in June, promising the best harvest in memory. By August, it was black soup. The smell, God forgive me, it smelled like death before death had even come. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn. The failed harvest of 1315 was just the opening act. Because while the peasants mourned their rotted grain, something else was happening. Something that would transform a bad harvest into an apocalypse. Guillaume of Soissons was not a typical peasant. He'd served in the king's army, learned his letters during a campaign, and returned home with enough silver to rent 5 strips of prime farmland. His account, preserved because the priest thought it might matter someday, gives us the only peasants. I view of the catastrophe unfolding in those fields. I have seen men die with their guts spilling onto French soil, Guillaume told the priest. But watching my wheat die was worse. A man dies once. My wheat died every day for 60 days, and each morning I watched it die again. The process was unlike anything farmers had encountered. Usually, crop failure was quick frost, drought, or pests. You knew within days if you were ruined. But 1315 tortured them with hope. Guillaume described walking his fields each dawn, and each dawn finding a new horror. First, the stalks grew too fast. In June, they shot up like they were racing toward heaven. We thought ourselves blessed. My wife danced between the rows, saying we'd have enough to sell, enough to buy that ox we'd dreamed of. The children planned what they'd eat at harvest feast: honey cakes, white bread, meat every Sunday until Christmas. But the unnatural growth was a warning, not a blessing. The constant rain and bizarre temperature swings had triggered something in the planter. Desperate attempt to reproduce before dying. The stalks grew tall but hollow. The kernels formed but never filled. By July, the color started changing. Not all at once. First, little spots like rust on a blade. We told ourselves it was nothing, just moisture. It would pass, but the spots spread. They merged, they consumed. A field that was green at sunrise would be brown by sunset. What Gideon was describing, though he couldn't know it, was a perfect storm of plant diseases. The cold, wet conditions had created ideal breeding grounds for multiple fungi. Stem rust, leaf blight, and ergot attacked simultaneously. But ergot was the cruelest. It didn't just destroy the grain, it transformed it into poison. The heads of wheat turned black and swollen, like fingers left too long in water. When you touched them, they burst, releasing clouds of black dust that made you cough blood. My neighbor Henry, trying to save something, anything, gathered these black kernels. His family ate bread made from them. Within 3 days, his children were screaming about devils in the walls. His wife's fingers turned black and fell off. Henry himself danced naked in the square until his heart burst. The aristocracy, watching from their castles, initially felt secure. They had stores from previous years, contracts with merchants, the ability to import grain. The Lord of Soissons, Robert de Courtenay, even rode through the failing fields in July, telling the peasants not to despair, that he would reduce their taxes, that no one would starve. But Lord Robert didn't understand what Gudayam understood. This wasn't one bad harvest. This was the end of agriculture itself. The ground changed. Gillam explained. It wasn't soil anymore. The rain had been falling so long, so hard, that all the good earth washed away. What remained was grey clay. That wouldn't hold seed, wouldn't grow weeds, wouldn't even grow the grass. It was like God had salted the earth, but with water instead of salt. By August, desperation drove innovation. Farmers tried everything their ancestors had never dreamed of. They built fires in the fields, trying to dry the soil. They dug drainage ditches that filled faster than they could empty them. They brought their livestock to sleep among the crops, hoping animal warmth might save something. An educated monk observing these efforts wrote, "They perform rituals that border on paganism, dancing naked under the full moon, burying live cats at field corners, bleeding themselves onto the soil. They have forgotten Christ and remembered older, darker gods, yet still the crops fail." The nobility began to panic when they realized the implications. No harvests meant no taxes. No taxes meant no armies. No armies meant no power. The entire feudal system depended on agricultural surplus. Without it, civilization itself would collapse. The Bishop of Reims recorded a meeting of local lords in August 1315. Lord Thibaut suggested we take what grain remains by force, store it in our castles, and let God sort the living from the dead. Lord Gautier proposed we sell our lands to Italian merchants who don't yet know of our catastrophe. Lord Felipe said nothing, just sharpened his sword throughout the meeting. We all knew what he was thinking. When the starving masses come, sharp steel might buy us more time than prayer. But it was Guillem's final observation that proved most prophetic. The worst part wasn't the hunger we knew was coming. It was what hunger would make us become. I saw my neighbor Marcel looking at his plump daughter differently. Not with father's love, with a butcher's calculation. I saw wives eyeing husbands who'd grown too weak to work. I saw children forming packs, like wolf cubs learning to hunt. The priest asks me what I think God wants from us. I tell him God is done wanting. Now he's taking. And he's going to keep taking until there's nothing left but rain and mud and sigh. And mud and sigh. The memory of what men used to be before they became animals again. The failed harvest of 1315 wasn't measured in bushels of lost grain. It was measured in the systematic destruction of hope. Every rural community in Europe had lived with the same rhythm for 1,000 years. Plant in spring, tend in summer, harvest in autumn, survive on stores through winter. That cycle was civilization. And in 1315, the cycle broke. By September, even the weeds had given up. Fields that should have been golden with wheat or barley were instead grey seas of mud, punctuated by the black skeletons of dead trees. The only things that grew were fungous, bulbous things that appeared overnight in colours nature had never intended. Purple, electric blue, sick yellow. Children who ate them died laughing. Adults who ate them died screaming. The recording. Priest added his own note to Gwilym's testimony. This man speaks truth. I have seen the fields myself. They look like God's own graveyard, waiting for the corpses that will soon fill them. We are not facing a famine. We are facing an extinction. May whoever finds this record pray for our souls, for by the time you read this, we will surely be past praying for ourselves. In September 1315, a strange sickness appeared among the cattle of Norfolk. Within days, it spread to sheep, then pigs, then horses. The animals didn't just die, they died screaming. A contemporary account describes cattle crying like humans. In their agony, their tongues swollen black, their eyes weeping blood. Modern historians call it marin, but medieval Europeans had another name for it. Devil's touch, because healthy animals would drop dead mid-step. A cow giving milk at dawn would be a corpse by noon, and the speed of transmission defied Logicantia herds gone in hours. But I haven't told you the worst part yet. The animals that survived, they changed. Horses began eating meat. Pigs turned feral, forming packs that hunted. And the rats. The rats disappeared entirely. Where did they go? That mystery wouldn't be solved for another 30 years, when they returned, carrying something far worse than hunger. The first recorded death was a prize bull named Samson, owned by the Earl of Norwich, worth more than most villagers earned. In a year, Samson was protected like royalty-sheltered stable, imported feed, 3 stable boys attending him constantly. On September 8th, he was healthy enough to breed. By September 9th, he was dead, his massive body twisted in angles that bones shouldn't allow. Foam tinged pink with blood dried around his mouth. The Earl's stable master, a methodical man named Walter, documented what happened next with the precision of someone who knew he was witnessing something unprecedented. The sickness jumped from Samson to the cows without touch, without sharing water, without even sharing air. They were in separate barns, yet by sunset, 17 were dead. Their deaths were not peaceful. They bellowed with voices that sounded human. They thrashed until their bones broke through their hides. They died with their eyes open, staring at something we could not see. Within a week, every cow in Norfolk was either dead or dying. But the disease didn't respect species boundaries. Sheep began falling next, their wool turning grey overnight before they collapsed. Then pigs, usually hardy enough to survive anything, started dying in ways that defied nature. They'd squeal for hours, a sound witnesses compared to children, screaming before their hearts simply exploded. A traveling merchant named Otto from Flanders recorded what he saw on the roads. "I have traveled these paths for 20 years. I know where every farm keeps its herds. Today, I counted 4,000 dead cattle between Lynn and Norwich. They lie where they fell in fields, on roads, some still standing upright, held by mud that is frozen around their legs. The smell reaches you a mile before you see them. Sweet rot mixed with something chemical, like copper left in vinegar. The speed of death was matched only by its strangeness. Animals died in patterns that suggested intelligent entire herds forming perfect circles before collapsing inward. Flocks of sheep arranging themselves in lines before dying in sequence, like dominoes. Witnesses spoke of animals appearing to communicate across species before death, horses whinnying to cows who lowed back, as if sharing some terrible knowledge. But then came the transformations among survivors, and this is where chronicle accounts become almost too bizarre to believe, except that multiple independent sources confirm the same phenomena. Sir William de Ross, a knight with lands across Yorkshire, wrote to the Archbishop of York, "Your Grace must believe what I write, though it sounds like madness. My destrier, Caesar, a warhorse I've ridden into 3 battles, has begun hunting. Not grazing, hunting. I watched him corner a rabbit, kill it with his hooves, and eat it. He tears flesh with teeth never meant for meat. Other horses flee from him now. He stands alone in his paddock, blood on his muzzle, waiting for something none of us understand. The pigs were worse. Those that survived the plague didn't return to their pens. They grouped together in the forests, moving in coordinated packs. A woodcutter named Thomas testified to the Bishop of Ely. 20 of them, maybe more, moving like wolves, but smarter than wolves. They set ambushes. They used one injured piglet as bait to draw a merchant from his cart. When he climbed down to help him, the others came from the trees. We found his bones 3 days later, picked clean, arranged in a pile like they were showing off. The transformation wasn't limited to behavior. Physical changes occurred that medieval veterinarians couldn't explain. Horses grew longer teeth, sharp enough to tear meat. Pigs developed thicker hides that arrows couldn't pierce. Chickens that survived grew black feathers, regardless of their original coloring, and their eggs, when cracked, contained blood instead of yolk. A learned monk, Brother Adlard, who had studied Arabic texts on animal husbandry, proposed a theory. The beasts know something we do not. They sense the world itself is dying and are changing to survive in whatever hellscape follows. They are becoming what they need to be. The question is, what does that make us, who cannot change? The economic implications were immediate and catastrophic. Medieval society ran on animal power. Oxen pulled plows. Horses carried knights. Sheep provided wool. Cattle gave milk and meat. Without them, agriculture collapsed entirely. You couldn't plant without oxen. You couldn't travel without horses. You couldn't stay warm without wool. The reeve of a manor in Lincolnshire left records showing the speed of collapse. September 1st, 200 cattle, 500 sheep, 60 pigs, 20 horses. October 1st, 3 cattle, 12 sheep, 0 pigs, 2 horses. The 2 horses that remain will not accept saddle or bridle. They watch us with eyes that show too much white. We dare not approach them. Desperate attempts at prevention failed spectacularly. Some communities tried isolating healthy animals, only to watch them die faster in confinement. Others attempted ancient remedies, hanging holly over stable doors, painting crosses in lamb's blood on barns, burying horse skulls at crossroads. The Bishop of Winchester ordered all animals blessed with holy water. They died mid-blessing, falling dead at the priest's feet. The most disturbing account comes from a monastery in Somerset, where Brother Francis observed something that shouldn't have been possible. The rats are gone. All of them. Not dead. We've found no bodies, simply vanished. The cats who hunted them sit in empty granaries, mewing at shadows. The barn owls have stopped hunting, stopped calling. Some have been found dead with full bellies, as if they ate something that killed them from within. But there are no rats. Where did they go? Into the walls, under the earth, or somewhere else entirely, somewhere they can wait out what's coming. This observation would prove prophetic. The rats had indeed gone somewhere deep into Eastern European forests, into cave systems, into places where they could breed and change and feast on the endless supply of corpses the famine would provide. When they returned in the 1340s, they brought the Black Death with them, as if they'd been preparing their revenge for 30 years. But in September 1315, all anyone knew was that the animals were dying or changing, and without them, human survival became nearly impossible. The social contract that had existed between human and beast for millennia, we feed you, you serve us, shattered completely. Nature itself had declared war on civilization, and the animals were its first casualties. In London, December 1315, something unprecedented happened. A wealthy merchant named Richard de Barkin tried to buy bread with a gold coin worth more than most people saw in a lifetime. The baker laughed in his face. "Can your gold fill my children's bellies? Can it bring back the grain?" This is the moment medieval Europe's entire economic system shattered. For the first time in recorded history, food became more valuable than gold. The price of wheat increased 800% in 6 months. But those are just numbers. Let me tell you what that really meant. Richard de Barkin wasn't just any merchant. He controlled the wine trade from Bordeaux to London, owned 3 ships, and held contracts with the royal household. His wealth was legendary. He'd once bought an entire street in London just to evict a rival. On that December morning, he walked into Thomas Baker's shop on Bread Street carrying a gold noble, a coin worth 80 silver pence, enough to buy a horse. Thomas Baker, his hands still dusted with the last of his flour, looked at the coin like it was a stone. "I have 1 loaf left," he said, "my last flour. When it's gone, I close my doors forever. That loaf goes to my children. Your gold cannot create grain from nothing." Richard, accustomed to gold opening every door, placed 2 more nobles on the counter. Thomas swept them onto the floor. "Take your metal to the Thames and see if the fish will trade bread for it. I'll keep my loaf." The story spread through London within hours, not because a rich man was refused bread, but because everyone suddenly understood. The fundamental assumption of civilization that money could buy necessities had died. The keeper of the Royal Exchange, Simon de Canterbury, recorded the complete collapse of monetary meaning. December 1st, 1 penny buys a loaf. December 15th, 1 shilling buys a loaf. December 30th, £1 buys a loaf. January 13, 16, no amount buys a loaf, for there are no loaves to buy. But the breakdown went deeper than inflation. The very concept of value imploded. A manuscript from Guildhall records an exchange that would have been incomprehensible months earlier. Margaret Carpenter traded her wedding ring, passed down 5 generations, for 2 turnips. John Smithson offered his house for a ham. The ham's owner refused. The guild system, which had regulated trade for centuries, collapsed overnight. The Worshipful Company of Bakers, once among London's most powerful guilds, disbanded when 8 of 12 members died trying to defend their shops from crowds. Their final record, dated January 3rd, 1316, states, "We dissolve this fellowship, as there is nothing left to fellow over. May God forgive what we have become." In Paris, the situation grew even more surreal. The provost of merchants, attempting to maintain order, issued daily price controls. Every morning, he'd announce the maximum legal price for bread. Every evening, bakers would ignore it entirely. One baker, hauled before the provost for charging 30 times the legal rate, responded, "Hang me if you wish. My corpse will bake no bread. Pay my price or starve legally, those are your choices." The relationship between social classes inverted overnight. A peasant with a hidden store of grain wielded more power than a duke with chests of gold. The Chronicle of St. Denis's records, the Count of Champagne, among the realm's richest men, was seen begging at a farmer's door. The farmer, who once would have been flogged for looking the Count in the eye, kept him waiting 3 hours before trading a sack of mouldy oats for the Count's sword, armor, and signet ring. Venice, Europe's commercial heart, tried to maintain normalcy through imports. The Doge sent ships to Egypt, to Constantinople, to anywhere grain might exist. Most never returned. Those that did brought news that shattered hope. The catastrophe wasn't regional. From Ireland to Poland, from Scotland to Sicily, the earth had stopped providing. A Venetian merchant's letter to his partner survives. "I have 40,000 ducats in gold. Yesterday, I tried to buy bread with it all. The baker said he'd rather throw his last loaf to the fish than trade it for coins. I offered him my palazzo. He laughed and said, 'Can I eat marble? Can I digest paintings? We have invented money, created banking, built commerce. None of it matters when there is nothing to buy.'" The church, traditionally the provider of last resort, faced impossible mathematics. The Abbey of Cluny's accounts show their dilemma starkly. "We have grain for 300 souls for 6 months. 7,000 souls crowd our gates. If we feed all 4, compassion's sake, all die in 3 weeks. If we feed only our brothers, we survive but lose our purpose. Christ multiplied loaves and fishes. We can only divide and subtract." Some monasteries chose martyrdom through generosity, opening their stores until empty, then dying with those they tried to save. Others became fortresses, monks armed with clubs, defending walls, while starving crowds pleaded outside. The abbot of Glastonbury wrote, "We have become what we swore never to be, choosers of who lives and who dies. Each grain of wheat is a decision. Each meal is a judgment. We are not God, yet we play him daily." The collapse of money created new forms of trade that horrified contemporary observers. the Bishop of Lincoln recorded, "Women sell themselves, not for coin, but for bread. A loaf buys what gold cannot. Mothers auction their children to whoever can feed them. These are not choices. These are mathematics of survival." In Hamburg, they developed a grotesque solution: the flesh market. Not selling human flesh, not yet, but selling the promise of it. People would sign contracts pledging their bodies after death in exchange for food while living. A German merchant wrote, "The dying sell their future corpses for present bread. Buyers mark their purchases, waiting like vultures. When someone falls, arguments break out over whose property they've become." The English crown attempted to maintain control through force. Edward II issued proclamations making food hoarding punishable by death. The result: those with food hid it better. Royal agents searching for hidden grain often found families dead of starvation, sitting around empty tables, having hidden their food so well they couldn't find it themselves in their final delirium. A royal clerk named William de Dean recorded, "The futility. We hanged a man for hiding grain. The crowd watching the execution fought over his shoes before he stopped kicking. We cannot hang hunger. We cannot execute starvation. The king commands the rain to stop, the crops to grow, the natural order to restore itself. The rain continues. The king might as well command the dead to rise." By February 1316, even the concept of theft had changed. How could taking food be a crime when not taking it meant death? London's courts stopped prosecuting food theft after jurors refused to convict. One judge wrote, "A man stole bread from a child. The child's mother killed the thief with her bare hands. Who is the criminal? Who is the victim?" Our laws were written for a world where food existed. That world is gone. The most profound change was in how people understood wealth itself. For 1,000 years, wealth meant gold, land, titles, power. Now it meant calories. The Archbishop of Canterbury observed, "A beggar with a hidden turnip is richer than a lord with a castle." We spent centuries accumulating treasures that now mean nothing. We should have been stockpiling grain. But who could imagine a world where gold couldn't buy bread? Who could conceive of money itself becoming worthless? This economic collapse wasn't temporary. Even after the harvests eventually returned, the absolute faith in currency never fully recovered. People remembered when gold meant nothing, when coins were just metal, when the entire elaborate system of commerce crumbled before the simple reality of hunger. They remembered when the only currency that mattered was food, and the only exchange rate was survival. Agnes's Norwich recorded in her household accounts the progression of what her family ate as 1316 dawned. January, barley bread mixed with sawdust. February, acorn flour and ground bones. March, boiled leather and tree bark. April's entry is just one line. We no longer record what we eat. The creativity of starvation is horrifying. Pine needles ground into paste. Clay mixed with the last drops of milk to make it filling. Parents secretly bleeding themselves at night to mix blood into their children's gruel for protein. But in the city of Erfurt, they discovered something that would haunt Europe's collective memory forever. The local tanner, a man who had grown mysteriously fat while others starved, was found to have a peculiar source of leather. The city records state only, he was burned alive by common consent, and none would speak of what was found in his cellar. Agnes of Norwich was a merchant's widow who'd kept meticulous household accounts for 20 years. Her ledger, preserved in Norwich Cathedral, transforms from mundane records into a descent through hell. Her husband had died in late 1315, leaving her with 4 children and what seemed like adequate stores. She'd managed households through hard times before, but this was different. January 1316. Mix true barley with sawdust from Thomas Carpenter's shop. 1 part grain to 1 part wood. The children notice but do not complain. The sawdust fills their bellies even if it provides no sustenance. We tell ourselves it is fiber, like bran. We pretend not to see the splinters in their stall. The recipe sections of her ledger became increasingly elaborate as real ingredients vanished. Acorn bread. Gather acorns before the pigs find them. Boil. 7 times to remove bitterness, the water turns black as sign. Dry what remains. Grind with stone's mill wheels are too precious for such base material. Mix with water and anything that binds egg. If God provides, blood if he doesn't. Bake until it stops smelling of forest rot. By February, even her precise nature couldn't hide the desperation. Bone meal from the butcher, he claims it's sheep, but the fragments look human-sized. I do not ask. Mix with the last acorn flour. Add melted snow, clean snow from rooftops, not the ground where the dead have lain. The children eat, their teeth hurt from the grinding. Better tooth pain than belly pain. A travelling monk who sheltered with Agnes that February wrote his own account. The widow feeds her children soup that is merely hot water with leather boiled until it releases some essence of the animal it once was. She watches them drink it with such intensity as if her gaze could transform it into beef stew. The youngest boy asks what meat this is. She says it is shukau. He accepts this. The substitutions became a science. Flemish merchants developed detailed guides for extending food that read like alchemical texts. Pine needle tea provides the sensation of eating when boiled thick enough. Add chalk dust for substance. The stomach believes it is full for precious hours. Warning: more than 3 cups daily causes blood in the urine. In Paris, a baker named Henri Fouquet was arrested for his miracle bread that stayed fresh for weeks. Under torture, he revealed the secret. Ground bones mixed with plaster, baked with real flour, spread only on the outside. People see bread, smell bread, initially tastes bread, he confessed. By the time they realize it's mostly limestone and corpse dust, they're too hungry to care. The Guild of Physicians in Montpellier documented the physical effects of these substitutions. Patients present with bellies swollen like pregnant women, yet they starve. Cut open after death, we find stomachs packed with clay, leather, wood, pulp, everything except food. They die full of nothing. Their bodies refuse to process tree bark into sustenance, no matter how finely ground, how carefully prepared. Children adapted faster than adults, developing tastes for the impossible. A priest in Reims wrote, "The young ones seek out specific trees, knowing which bark tastes less bitter. They have favorites: soak over ash, young wood over old. They teach each other which mushrooms cause the least pain, which grasses fill the belly longest." Children who should be learning Latin are instead becoming experts in eating the inedible. But March brought innovations that crossed into nightmare. Agnes's ledger, her handwriting now shaky. Martha Fisher says fresh blood from living animals goes further than from the dead. A cup drawn from a cow still walking provides more strength than meat from a week-old corpse. We take turns cutting our last goat, keeping it alive, taking just enough. It screams now when it sees us coming with the bowl. The monastery at Fulda recorded even darker adaptations. Brother Marcus suggests we bleed ourselves in rotation, each monk providing for others. The abbot forbids it, calling it cannibalism by degrees. But when the abbot falls ill, we find he's been secretly bleeding himself to feed the youngest novices. His arms are covered in cuts. He dies drained, literally and figuratively. In London, they discovered people grinding the mortar from between stones of ancient Roman walls. It contained traces of animal blood used in its mixing centuries ago. They call it stone soup, wrote the sheriff. They believe Roman blood maintains potency across 1,000 years. The city walls are disappearing as people eat our defenses. The absolute nadir came in Erfurt, where Hermann the tanner had maintained his weight while everyone else became skeletal. His neighbors noticed he always had meat, always had leather to work, even as all animals had died months ago. They noticed, too, that missing persons' clothes appeared in his shop, cleaned and folded. The investigation began when a mother recognized her missing daughter's distinctive birthmark on a piece of leather. The city records are deliberately vague. Found in his cellar, barrels of salt meat bearing no resemblance to any beast, skins hanging that showed tattoos and scars, bones too stray to be cattle, too thick to be pig. The mob didn't wait for trial. They sealed Hermann in his own tanning vat and boiled him alive. His screams lasted 3 hours. No one considered this excessive, but Hermann wasn't unique. Across Europe, the mathematics of survival created impossible choices. A Dutch merchant wrote, "In Amsterdam, we no longer ask what meat is served. We know, we all know, but we eat it and pretend it's pork. The alternative is death. God forgive us, but he's the one who sent this famine." Agnes of Norwich's final food relay entry, April 1316, is indeed just one line. We no longer record what we eat, but she continued writing other observations. May, my youngest son no longer asks for food. June, found Margaret's teeth in her bed. They fell out in the night. July, we have forgotten the taste of bread. August contains no words, just tally marks, possibly counting days, possibly counting deaths. The last entry, September 1316, in a different hand. Agnes died this morning. We found her in the garden, eating earth, smiling. She said it tasted like heaven. We buried her where she fell. The ground was already open from her feeding. We are what remains of her family. We have survived on what she taught us to eat. We have survived on what she refused to eat. Both lessons were love. The Great Substitution wasn't just about replacing food with non-food. It was about replacing civilization with survival, morality with mathematics, humanity with hunger. Every successful substitution, every recipe for bark bread, every method for making leather edible was both a triumph of human ingenuity and a step towards something inhuman. Here's a question that sounds simple until you're living it. If you have enough food for your family to survive 6 months, but your neighbor's children are dying today, what do you do? Share and all die in 3 months? Or bar your door and listen to them cry? A priest in Ghent documented these impossible choices. A mother of 4, calculating exactly how much food each child needed based on their chances of survival. The strongest got more, the weakest ... didn't. She loved them all, he wrote. That's why she chose. Father Benedict of Ghent had been a priest for 30 years when the famine came. His parish records, instead of births and deaths, became a chronicle of moral arithmetic that would haunt him until his own death. He wrote not in Latin, but in common Flemish, wanting everyone to understand what survival really cost. Elizabeth van Meer, mother of 4, widow, has grain hidden beneath her floor enough for 6 months if one person eats, 3 months if to eat, 6 weeks if all 5 eat. She came to confession not for absolution but for mathematics. Father, she said, tell me God's formula for choosing which children live. Elizabeth's children ranged from 14 to 3. The eldest, Jan, strong enough to work if work existed. The twins, Marie and Catherine, 9 years old, clever but frail. The youngest, Peter, barely walked but consumed as much as the others. Father Benedict recorded her terrible calculus. She weighs them each week on the merchant scale. Charts their decline. Jan loses weight, slowest his body large enough to consume itself gradually. Peter loses fastest, no reserves in that tiny frame. The twins fall between. She creates equations. If Jan gets double rations for 3 weeks, he might strong enough to steal food for the others. If Peter gets nothing for 3 days, his suffering ends and the others get 9 more days each. These are not thoughts, these are numbers. Cold, merciless numbers. The priest watched Elizabeth transform from mother to mathematician. She no longer sees children. She sees survival probabilities. Jan, 70% chance if fed properly. The twins, 40% each if maintained, but 60% for one if the other stops eating. Peter, 15% regardless. She doesn't cry when she does these calculations. Tears are water the body cannot spare. But Elizabeth wasn't unique. Across Europe, parents performed similar calculations. A merchant in Bruges is left a ledger that makes accountants weep. Assets, 3 children, 1 wife, self, liabilities, love, compassion, memory of better times. Formula for survival. Assets minus liabilities equals tomorrow. In London, a wealthy lawyer named Thomas Hardwick documented his family's rationing system with legal precision. Established a tribunal each morning. Each family member presents their case for food. Activities of previous day weighed against probable future utility. Wife sewing equals quarter ration. Son studying equals 1/8 ration. Knowledge feeds no one now. Daughter spinning equals half ration. Wool still has value. Baby crying equals no ration. Noise attracts hungry neighbors. The mathematics extended beyond families. Entire communities developed survival algorithms. The village of Wickham created what they called the life lottery. Every Sunday, families drew lots. Winners got the week's communal food. Losers got nothing. But here's the insane part. Families could trade lottery tickets. A mother with 1 child might sell her chance to a father with 4, calculating that certain death with payment beat probable death without. Father Benedict recorded a town meeting that descended into pure calculation. The baker proposed we stop feeding anyone over 50, they've lived their lives. The blacksmith countered, we stop feeding anyone under 5, they're too young to remember better times. Won't miss what they never knew. The mayor suggested we feed only those who can work. The priest asked who would bury the dead. The meeting ended with no decision. Mathematics cannot solve philosophy. The church itself wasn't immune to these calculations. The Bishop of Tonnerre issued guidelines that read like actuarial tables: orphans under 7, half rations, orphans 7 to 12, full rations if they work, orphans over 12, no rations old enough to fend for themselves, widows with children, proportional to number of surviving offspring, widows without children, God will provide. A monastery in Liège developed even more complex formulas. Each monk assessed daily, prayer hours multiplied by manual labor divided by food consumed. Those whose spiritual productivity falls below temporal consumption must fast until the equation balances. Brother Francis, young and strong, eats daily. Brother Augustine, old and weak, but whose prayers are powerful, eats thrice weekly. We have mathematized the soul. The most heartbreaking account comes from a school teacher in Cologne who tried to save her students. 23 children in my care. Food for 5. I create competitions. Best recitation gets bread. Fastest runner gets soup. But children understand. They know it's not about merit, but about choosing who dies educated. Little Wilhelm, bright as sunrise, asked me, "Teacher, if I die today, can Thomas have tomorrow's lesson and my portion?" He was 7. He understood the trade. Some communities tried to remove human choice from the equation entirely. In Basel, they built what they called the Wheel of Fortune, a great spinning disc with names. Each day, spin the wheel. Where it stops determines who eats. Pure chance. No favoritism, no guilt. The wheel chose who lived and died. Citizens preferred random cruelty to deliberate choice. A Venetian merchant named Carlo Dandolo wrote the most clinical assessment. Sentiment is luxury. Love is liability. Calculate thus: calories needed per pound of human maintained, work output possible per calorie invested, return on investment measured in days survived. My eldest son provides best ratio, strong enough to forage, smart enough to steal. My youngest daughter provides worse, consumes without producing. The middle children are variables, depending on daily performance. I am not a monster, I am an equation. But perhaps the most disturbing mathematics came from those who calculated backwards, not from food to survival, but from death to food. How many must die for the rest to live? If the population halves, do rations double? These calculations appeared in secret documents, burned after reading. But Father Benedict saw enough to write. They draw circles on maps. This district has grain for 1,000. Population 3,000. Solution: ensure 2,000 die quickly. How? Bar thee. Gates poison the wells. Spread disease. These are not plans of war. These are plans of peace. Peaceful elimination of excess population. The psychological toll of these calculations broke minds. Elizabeth Van Meer, the mother from the beginning, eventually snapped. Father Benedict found her one morning, feeding all her children equally, generously, using their entire store in one meal. She said, she solved the equation, he wrote. Everyone dies together, full, happy, as a family. No choosing. No survivors bearing guilt. Mathematical perfection, 0 equals 0. But she couldn't do it. At the last moment, she hid a portion, gave it to Jan, the eldest, and walked into the forest with the 3 younger children. They found her frozen arms around the little ones, all of them smiling. Jan survived, found by traders, raised by strangers. Years later, he became a mathematician, obsessed with solving unsolvable problems, never saying why. Father Benedict's final entry on the mathematics of survival: God gave us multiplication be fruitful and increase. The devil gave us division, choose who lives and dies. We have become expert in dark arithmetic, subtracting souls, dividing families, calculating the minimum viable population. We measure love in ounces of grain, weigh souls against bread. Calculate the exchange rate between mercy and survival. Every choice is an equation. Every equation is a condemnation. Every survivor is a mathematician who solved for x, where x equals continued existence and all other variables equals 0. The mathematics of survival reduced human society to its most basic algorithm. Who dies so others live? Every family, every community, every institution faced this equation. Some solved for maximum survival, others for minimum suffering. None solved for justice, because justice requires abundance, and abundance was memory. These calculations left scars that lasted generations. Survivors could never forget the arithmetic they'd performed, the variables they'd eliminated, the human constants they'd reduced to 0. They'd learned that civilization was just addition, add food, add comfort, add morality, and that's survival, which is subtraction. Subtract the weak, subtract the old, subtract love itself if necessary. In the end, the only sum that mattered was greater than 0. In the summer of 1316, something extraordinary happened. The rain stopped for 3 weeks, just long enough for desperate farmers to plant whatever seeds remained. The chroniclers called it God's mercy. Markets opened, people celebrated. A merchant in Bruges wrote to his partner, "The curse is lifted. Prepare the wagons." The crops grew with supernatural speed in the brief sunshine. Green shoots everywhere. Hope returned like a physical warmth. Families who had been preparing to separate to increase survival chances made plans to reunite. Then came August 10th, 1316, the day the hail began. Chunks of ice the size of goose eggs. For 3 hours, every single plant that had grown in those precious 3 weeks was obliterated. Not damaged, obliterated, crushed into the mud so thoroughly that you couldn't tell fields from road. The Bruges merchant's next letter contained only one line: "God has abandoned us entirely." But let me tell you how those 3 weeks unfolded, because understanding the height of hope makes the fall into despair that much more devastating. July 18th, 1316. Dawn came without rain for the first time in 14 months. Not drizzle, not mist, but actual absence of water from the sky. In Paris, people stood in the streets, faces upturned, confused by the sensation of dryness. Children who'd been born during the deluge touched sunlight for the first time and screamed they thought they were burning. Brother Michel of Cluny recorded the moment. The clouds parted like curtains drawn by God's own hand, light actual. Golden light poured onto the earth. Monks fell to their knees, not in prayer, but in disbelief. We had forgotten the sun could exist without water. Word spread faster than plague. Church bells rang continuously, not for death this time, but for resurrection. In every village, town, and city, people emerged from their homes like creatures crawling from caves. Pale, skeletal, blinking in brilliance they'd forgotten existed. The merchant Jacob van Bruges wrote to his partner Hans in Antwerp with trembling hand. The curse is lifted. God has remembered us. The rain has stopped. Prepare, the wagons will have grain to trade by autumn. Tell everyone survival is possible again. Markets that had been closed for months exploded back to life. Not with food, there was still no food, but with hope transformed into commerce. People traded promises, futures, possibilities. A farmer would pledge his upcoming harvest for tools. A baker would promise future bread for present shelter. The economy, dead for a year, gasped back to life on nothing but anticipated abundance. The seeds came from everywhere and nowhere, hidden in walls, buried in yards, hoarded in attics. Every kernel that had been saved, just in case, was brought into the light. Some families had protected seed grain while their children starved, betting everything on this exact moment. They'd been called monsters. Now they were visionaries. The planting was religious ecstasy mixed with desperate efficiency. In Normandy, the entire surviving population, nobles, merchants, priests, children, went into the fields. The Duke of Normandy himself, who hadn't touched soil in his lifetime, was seen on his knees, pressing seeds into earth with tears streaming down his face. A young girl named Marguerite wrote in her diary, "Papa says we're planting hope. Mama says we're planting survival. I think we're planting prayers and watching to see if God makes them grow." And grow they did. The crops erupted from the soil with impossible vigor. Wheat that should take weeks to sprout appeared in 3 days. Barley shot up overnight. Beans climbed their poles so fast you could watch them move. The chroniclers, usually skeptical men, wrote of agricultural miracle. It is as if the earth, starved for so long of its purpose, is making up for lost time, wrote the Bishop of Rouen. The crops grow with such speed that farmers sleep in their fields, afraid to miss the harvest moment. Green spreads across the land like God painting with life itself. The markets transformed overnight. The champagne fairs, dead for 2 years, announced their return. Merchants who'd hidden through the catastrophe emerged with old contracts, ready to trade. Ships that had rotted in harbors were hastily repaired. Trade routes, abandoned to bandits and nature, were cleared by communities working together for the first time in months. In Florence, they held an impromptu festival. Not planned, just spontaneous explosion of joy. Musicians who'd sold their instruments, played drums, made from barrels. Dancers who'd forgotten how to smile, laughed until they cried. Children who'd never known celebration invented it on the spot. An Italian chronicler wrote, "We feast on nothing but hope, and it fills us better than bread ever did." Families made reunion plans. Fathers who'd sent sons away to increase survival odds sent word to return. Mothers who'd placed daughters in convents prepared to bring them home. Communities that had fractured into hostile fragments began to speak of reconciliation. The 3 weeks of sun didn't just grow crops, they grew possibility. A priest in Ghent gave a sermon that captured the moment. "We have walked through the valley of death's shadow. But see, the shadow lifts. The valley blooms. We are Job, tested and found faithful. We are Noah, watching the waters recede. We are Lazarus, called from the tomb. Even the nobility, who'd maintained distance from their starving subjects, joined. The collective delusion. The Count of Flanders announced a harvest festival for September, promising wine from reserves nobody knew existed. The King of France declared that all debts incurred during the unfortunate rain would be forgiven once. The harvest was complete. The Pope issued a bull declaring the famine officially ended by divine intervention. The crops grew so fast that some whispered of dark magic. In Germany, rumors spread that the plants were unnatural, fed by the corpses of the million dead, growing on human fertilizer. But even these whispers were dismissed. Who cared if the wheat grew from graves? The living needed bread. By August 9th, the fields were green carpets of promise. The wheat stood tall, the barley swayed golden, the beans hung heavy on their vines. Another week, maybe two, and harvest could begin. Calculations were made not of who would die, but of who would live. All of them. All would live. The night of August 9th, strange clouds gathered. Not rain clouds, something else. They glowed with an odd green light. Lightning without thunder. Wind without direction. Animals, the few that remained, became restless. Horses screamed. Dogs howled. Cats vanished entirely. August 10th, 1316. 2:47 in the afternoon. The exact time is known because the clock tower in Bruges stopped when the first hailstone hit it. They fell like God's own artillery. Ice chunks the size of goose eggs, driven by winds that shouldn't exist in August. But these weren't normal hailstones. Witnesses described them as sharp, angular, some shaped like pyramids, others like daggers. They didn't just fall, they attacked in. The fields of Flanders, farmers tried to shield their crops with their own bodies. The hail broke their backs, shattered their skulls, left them dead atop the plants they'd tried to protect. Children sent to bring in animals were found hours later, beaten to death by ice from the sky. But the crops suffered worse. The hail didn't just flatten them, pulverized them, drove them so deep into the mud that archaeologists still find compressed plant matter at that geological layer. 3 weeks of growth erased in 3 hours. Not damage deleted. The fields looked like they'd been scraped clean by God's own hand. When it stopped, silence fell across Europe. Not peaceful silence, the silence of complete despair. People stood in their obliterated fields, unable to speak, unable to cry, unable to comprehend. The hope hadn't been gradually eroded, had been murdered in a single afternoon. Jacob van Vey. Bruges, the merchant who'd written so joyfully to his partner, sent one final letter. Not even a letter, just 8 words on a torn piece of parchment. God has abandoned us entirely. Do not come. The suicides began that evening. Not the slow suicide of starvation, but immediate, decisive ending. Entire families walking hand in hand into rivers. Farmers hanging themselves from trees that overlooked their destroyed fields. Bakers closing themselves in their ovens. The Diocese of Reims recorded 300 suicides in 3 days. Those were just the ones found. A chronicler in Paris wrote, "The cruelty was not in taking the crops. It was in letting them grow first, in letting us believe, in letting us hope. This was not God testing faith. This was God showing us faith is mockery. We are not Job. Job was loved enough to be tested. We are nothing. The 3 weeks of sun had been crueler than 14 months of rain. The rain had killed slowly, allowing adjustment, acceptance. The false hope killed instantly, crushing spirits that had just dared to unfold. Those who'd shared their last seeds, believing in tomorrow, now faced starvation with nothing. Those who'd emerged from hiding, trusting in recovery, were now exposed with nowhere to return. The miracle markets closed forever. When archaeologists excavate medieval marketplaces, they find a distinct layer dated to August 13th. Coins, rotted wagon wheels, and human remains of those who simply laid down where they stood and never got up again. Hope, it turns out, is the cruelest killer of all. You might think the nobility weathered this better. They had stores, armies, stone walls. Let me tell you about the Count of Flanders' winter feast of 1317. 40 nobles gathered in his great hall, the last of the wine flowing, the final reserves of grain baked into bread. They ate, they danced, they pretended the world wasn't ending. By morning, 12 were dead, not from poison, from shock. Their bodies, weakened by months of subtle starvation, couldn't process the sudden richness. The Count himself survived. 3 more days, long enough to dictate his final words. My castle is my coffin. Let none enter until the curse lifts. They found his body 4 years later. He had burned his furniture, his tapestries, even his books for warmth. The richest man in Flanders died gnawing on leather straps. The feast itself had been an act of delusion dressed as defiance. Count Louis of Nevers had sent invitations in December 1316, written on vellum worth more than food. Let us gather as nobility ought, to demonstrate that breeding conquers nature. The guests who arrived on January 6th, the feast of the Epiphany, looked like spectres playing at being lords. The Duchess of Brabant arrived in a carriage pulled by servants her horses had been eaten months ago. The Duke of Luxembourg wore armor that hung loose on his shrunken frame, clanking with every movement like bones in a box. The Bishop of Liege blessed the meal with hands that shook from more than cold, his episcopal ring sliding off fingers made skeletal by hunger. But they maintained the facade. They spoke of hunting parties that would never happen, of spring tournaments already impossible, of marriages between children who were likely dead. The Count's Chamberlain, Robert de Bethune, later wrote in his secret diary, "We dressed corpses. In silken made them dance. We were already dead. The feast was merely our funeral performed by the deceased. The meal itself was madness." After months of eating ground acorns and boiled leather, they faced actual bread, real meat, wine that wasn't mixed with water and prayers. The Count had emptied his entire reserve, deciding either everyone would survive together or die with dignity. He chose wrong. They died with neither survival nor dignity. The Countess of Hainault was the first to fall, her stomach rupturing from the sudden expansion. She died vomiting blood onto her ermine cloak, apologizing for the mess. The young Baron of Chamaille collapsed with wine running from his nose, his body unable to remember how to process alcohol. One by one, they fell like dominoes, their starved systems overwhelmed by abundance. The survivors watched their friends die from eating. The cruelest irony in a world already drowning in cruel ironies. The Count himself ate carefully, sparingly, but even he couldn't escape. His physician, one of 3 nobles who survived the night, recorded, "His lordship's body shook as if possessed. He sweated ice in January. His eyes bled. He knew death was coming and used his remaining strength to bar the castle doors from inside, condemning himself to die alone rather than risk others entering for the remaining food." Across Europe, similar scenes played out in every castle. These fortresses, built to withstand armies, couldn't withstand hunger. Stone walls kept enemies out, but kept starvation in. Moats that protected against invasion became barriers preventing. Foraging. Height advantage meant nothing when there was nothing below worth taking. The Duke of Burgundy's castle at Dijon became infamous for what chroniclers called the vertical graveyard. As servants and knights died, they were stacked in the towers, frozen by winter, preserved in their positions of death. By spring 1317, visitors could climb the tower stairs and pass through layers of the dead, each floor representing a different week of mortality. The Duke himself was found at the top, seated on his throne, frozen mid-gesture, as if still issuing commands to the dead below. In England, the situation was equally dire. Edward II's own court at Westminster ran out of food in February 1317. The King of England, ruler of territories from Scotland to Gascony, was reduced to sending knights to rob his own subjects' gardens for turnips. A chronicle records, His Majesty was seen gnawing a candle made of tallow, declaring it tasted better than nothing, which was the alternative. The nobility's suffering was different from the peasants, not worse, but uniquely horrible. They had never learned to survive without excess. A peasant knew how to stretch grain, how to forage, how to make something from nothing. Nobles knew only how to command others to provide. When there were no others left, or nothing to provide, they were helpless. Lady Margaret de Clare, one of England's wealthiest women, left a diary that captures this helplessness. "I own 17 manors, but cannot eat earth. I have chests of gold, but gold provides no sustenance. I have titles and right and privileges, all worthless as the parchment they're written on. My servants are dead or fled. I, who never dress myself, now cannot light a fire. I will die, not from hunger, but from ignorance of survival." The castle hierarchies collapsed in ways that would have been unthinkable before. The Earl of Warwick's chronicle describes finding his cook a commoner sitting in the Earl's chair, eating the last food while the Earl's children begged for scraps. When confronted, the cook simply said, "I know how to prepare food. You know how to eat it. Which skill matters now?" The Earl had no answer. Some nobles attempted to maintain order through increasingly desperate measures. The Count of Toulouse issued edicts from his castle requiring peasants to deliver food that didn't exist. When they didn't comply, he sent knights to punish them. The knights found empty villages, just wind and bones. They returned to find the Count dead, his final edict still clutched in his hand. Let them eat loyalty. The collapse of noble authority was physical as well as social. Castles required constant maintenance, roofs needed patching, walls needed pointing, fires needed feeding. Without servants, these monuments to power became tombs of privilege. Rain poured through unrepaired roofs. Frost cracked unmaintained walls. The magnificence became the miserable. Baron Heinrich von Steinberg in Bavaria documented his castle's decay. January, the Great Hall's roof collapses. February, Ice forms inside, creating frozen waterfalls from ceiling to floor. March. We burn the banquet table for warmth. April. We burn the portraits of our ancestors. May. We burn the chapel pews, begging God's forgiveness. June. We burn the doors, accepting that we're already in hell. The psychological toll on nobility was particularly severe because they had no framework for understanding poverty. A peasant expected hardship, it was life. A noble experienced hardship as cosmic betrayal. God had ordained their superiority. This suffering suggested God had changed his mind. The abbess of Fantavrolt, herself, noble-born, wrote, "They come to me, these duchesses and countesses, asking why God has abandoned them. I tell them God hasn't abandoned them, he's simply treating them like everyone else. They find this more terrifying than abandonment. Some nobles attempted escape through marriage, not for alliance, but for food. The Count of Champagne offered his daughter to anyone who could provide a year's grain. A wealthy merchant accepted, then discovered the Count had already eaten the grain before the wedding. The merger of nobility and merchant class, which would normally take centuries, happened in months, paid for in bread. Others chose more extreme exits. The Duke of Austria held what he called the final tournament nobles, jousting not for honor, but for the right to eat the loser's horses. The Duke himself participated and lost, whether deliberately or through weakness, unknown. His horse fed 12 people for 3 days. The Duke's body fed the crows. By the winter of 1318, castle after castle stood empty, not conquered, abandoned. The noble families that survived did so by abandoning everything that made them noble. They fled to cities, to monasteries, to anywhere that might have food. Princes became beggars. Duchesses became servants. The feudal order didn't fall, it starved to death. The Count of Flanders' castle stood sealed for 4 years before anyone dared enter. When they finally broke down the doors in 1321, they found a scene from nightmare. The Count's body sat at his desk, quill in hand, having documented his own death. Day 1, alone with enough food for months if careful. Day 15, ate the cats. Day 30, ate the leather from books. Day 45, discovered one can chew tapestries for the illusion of eating. Day 60, weakness makes writing difficult. Day 71, God is silence. Day 80, I understand now, this castle was always my tomb. I just lived in it before dying in it. His final entry, barely legible. Nobility means nothing to hunger. Hunger recognizes no titles, no bloodlines, no divine right. We built these castles to protect us from enemies. We never imagined the enemy would be emptiness itself. Stone walls cannot keep out starvation. Golden crowns provide no nourishment. We ruled by God's grace. We die by God's indifference. Let whoever finds this know, we were not better, we were just better fed, until we weren't. In the midst of this frozen hell, something strange began happening. Groups of people started walking naked through the snow, whipping themselves, claiming the cold couldn't touch true believers. They called themselves the Brethren of the Cross. But locals had another name, Ice Apostles. Their leader, a former monk named Heinrich, preached that the famine wasn't God's punishment, it was God's gift. He freezes the world to preserve the faithful for paradise, Heinrich declared. His followers would stand naked in blizzards until they collapsed. believing hypothermia was religious ecstasy. But here's what the chroniclers don't usually mention. In villages where the ice apostle was passed through, the death rate dropped. Not from miracles, from mathematics. Every follower who froze to death meant more food for those who remained. Heinrich of Cologne had been a respectable Dominican monk until the winter of 1316. He'd studied theology in Paris, could read Greek and Hebrew, and was known for his reasoned sermons on divine mercy. Then something broke in him. Maybe it was finding his entire monastery frozen to death during morning prayers. Maybe it was the child who died in his arms asking why God made her hungry. Whatever the cause, Heinrich emerged from that winter transformed. His first sermon as leader of the Ice Apostles was delivered naked in a blizzard outside Mainz Cathedral. You cling to warmth as if warmth is life. You fear cold as if cold is death. But I tell you, the cold is God's own embrace. The frozen are the chosen. This ice age is not ending, but beginning. God is freezing the world to preserve his faithful like saints, relics preserved in crystal. The theology was insane, but internally consistent. Heinrich taught that the Great Famine was actually the beginning of paradise. The cold was purifying the world. The hunger was freeing souls from flesh. Death by freezing was not death, but transformation, the body becoming one with God's frozen perfection. His followers didn't die. They crystallized into eternal forms. The Bishop of Cologne wrote in horror, Heinrich strips his followers naked, men, women, children, and leads them in procession through the snow. They sing hymns while their flesh turns blue, then black. They call frostbite gods kisses when toes fall off from freezing. They celebrate the shedding of earthly weight. They stand in frozen rivers until they cannot stand, then lay down to complete their transformation. But Heinrich was clever in his madness. He didn't demand immediate death. The transformation was gradual. First, initiates gave up cloaks, then shoes, then undergarments. Each stage brought them closer to divine coldness. This gradual exposure meant some survived long enough to spread the movement. Others died at precisely calculated intervals, creating a steady stream of martyrs without eliminating the entire group at once. The rituals were elaborate and horrifying. The baptism of ice involved breaking through frozen rivers and submerging converts until they stopped shivering. Heinrich claimed this was the moment the soul accepted divine cold. The communion of snow had followers eating only snow for days, claiming it was bread from heaven, already blessed by God's frozen touch. A merchant from Nuremberg witnessed their evening prayers. Hundreds of naked bodies kneeling in snow, their skins so blue it looked painted. They whipped themselves with branches frozen into ice clubs, each strike shattering skin like broken pottery. Blood froze before it could flow. They called it red ice prayer beads. Children among them, babies even, held up by dying mothers, all singing about the warmth of freezing. The movement spread with terrifying speed. By spring 1317, ice apostle groups appeared from Poland to England. Each had their own variation of Heinrich's teachings, but all shared the core belief. The cold was sacred, survival was sin, and freezing to death was the highest form of worship. In France, they called themselves Les Gelées Saints, the frozen saints. They would stand motionless in town squares during blizzards, human statues gradually covered in snow until they died standing. Townspeople would find them in the morning, frozen mid-prayer, and debate whether to move bodies that looked more like ice sculptures than corpses. The English variant. The Frost Brothers added self-cannibalism to their practices. As members froze to death, others would eat their frozen flesh, claiming it was purified by God's cold, and therefore not cannibalism but communion. The Archbishop of Canterbury banned the movement, but enforcement was impossible for authorities who tried to arrest Frost. Brothers found only frozen corpses arranged in disturbing tableaus. But here's what made the Ice Apostles truly insidious. They targeted the most vulnerable. Heinrich actively recruited the elderly, the sick, the starving, those already near death. He offered them meaning for their suffering. Instead of dying forgotten in some hovel, they could die as martyrs in public spectacles. A widow named Agnes wrote before joining them, "My children are dead. My husband is dead. I will die within days regardless. Heinrich offers me the choice to die for something instead of from something. Is joining madness worse than dying sane but meaningless?" The mathematics of their deaths were coldly practical. A village of 100 people with food for 50 had a problem. If 30 Ice Apostles achieved transformation, suddenly there was enough for the remaining 70. The movement solved starvation through voluntary mass suicide disguised as religious ecstasy. Some villagers actively encouraged the Ice Apostles. The mayor of Strasbourg secretly provided Heinrich with lists of the dying poor, suggesting them as ready for transformation. The town council of Basel offered the Ice Apostles free passage but required them to perform their freezing rituals outside town walls. They wanted the benefits of fewer mouths without the spectacle of public death. Heinrich himself seemed aware of this dynamic. In a letter to a former colleague, he wrote, "They think I'm mad, perhaps, but my madness feeds their children. Every follower who freezes is one less competitor for grain. We are solving the famine through faith. Is it not better to die believing you're achieving paradise than to die knowing you're just starving?" The church struggled to respond. Declaring the movement heretical was easy. Stopping it was impossible. How do you prevent people from freezing themselves to death when they're going to freeze to death anyway? The Pope issued bulls condemning the Ice Apostles. But papal authority meant little to people who believed the Pope himself was too warm to understand God's frozen truth. Some priests tried infiltrating the movement to redirect it. Father Johannes of Worms joined a group, gradually convincing them that true freezing required surviving winter to freeze again next year. He saved dozens through this theological manipulation. But Heinrich heard of this and declared that any Ice Apostle who survived winter had failed their transformation and must try harder next time. The movement produced disturbing art. Ice Apostles would arrange dying members into religious scenes, frozen nativity displays using real dying people, crucifixion tableaus with followers frozen to wooden crosses, recreations of the Last Supper with participants dying at table. These displays would remain until spring thaw revealed the horror underneath the snow. Children raised in the movement knew no other reality. A boy named Wilhelm, rescued at age 7, couldn't understand warmth. He would scream when brought near. Fires, tear off clothes, stand outside during blizzards, begging to return to God's cold. He never recovered, spending his adult life sleeping on stone floors, eating snow when available, eternally seeking the frozen paradise of his youth. The end of the Ice Apostles came not from suppression, but from success. By 1318, most vulnerable, Populations who might join had already transformed. Heinrich himself disappeared during the winter of 1318 to 1319. Some say he finally achieved his own transformation, freezing solid while preaching. Others claim he was seen years later in Spain, warm and well-fed, having abandoned the movement once it served its purpose. A final account from a survivor provides the most chilling perspective. Maria of Augsburg, who left the movement days before. Her planned transformation wrote, "We knew we were committing suicide." Heinrich knew. Everyone knew. But we dressed it in ritual and meaning because meaningless death was unbearable. The ice apostles didn't worship cold, we worshipped having a choice in how we died. In a world where death was certain, choosing. Its form felt like freedom. The demographic impact was significant. Historians estimate the ice apostles removed between 50,000 and 100,000 people from the population, voluntary deaths that paradoxically helped others survive. Villages that hosted ice apostles had marginally better survival rates than those that didn't. The movement was simultaneously mass murder and mass mercy, but the psychological impact lasted generations. The idea that death could be repackaged as victory, that suffering could be transformed through rhetoric into triumph, became embedded in European consciousness. Future apocalyptic movements would use Heinrich's template: take the inevitable, declare it divine, and lead the desperate into believing their destruction is actually their deliverance. The ice apostles left no churches, no holy books, no official record. Only frozen bodies in strange positions, mass graves of the willingly dead, and the disturbing realization that when survival becomes impossible, humans will invent religions that make death a sacrament. They proved that in extreme conditions. The line between martyrdom and mass suicide disappears, and that sometimes, perhaps most terrifyingly, they serve the same mathematical function: fewer mouths to feed in a world that has forgotten how to provide food. By 1318, the concept of nations began to dissolve. The King of England couldn't feed his army. The French crown controlled only Paris. The Holy Roman Emperor ruled nothing but his own hunger. But local warlords thrived. A minor knight with a sword. Grain supplies suddenly commanded more power than dukes. These frost lords, as they were called, built tiny kingdoms that lasted weeks or months. Their reigns ended predictably. When the food ran out, their followers ate them. The Bishop of Strasbourg recorded one such ending. Lord Wilhelm's men roasted him over his own hearth. They claimed he had grown fat on their suffering, so it was only just. His screams echoed across the frozen Rhine. When questioned, his captain said simply, he tasted of betrayal. The traditional structure of medieval war for kings commanding. Lords commanding knights, commanding soldiers collapsed when soldiers realized their commanders had no food to offer. A knight's oath of fealty meant nothing to an empty stomach. By early 1318, Europe had fractured into thousands of micro-kingdoms, each centered around whoever controlled food. Sir Roderick of Ghent, a minor knight with no title beyond his sword, became more powerful than the Duke of Burgundy simply because he had discovered a monastery's hidden grain store. With 40 bushels of wheat, he recruited an army of 300 starving men. They called him the Wheat King, and for 6 weeks, he ruled a territory spanning 3 villages. His reign followed a pattern that would become horrifyingly common. Week 1. Triumphant distribution of food to followers. Week 2. Strict rationing. As reality set in. Week 3. increasingly desperate raids on neighboring territories. Week 4. Internal conflicts over dwindling supplies. Week 5. The mathematics becoming clear. Week 6. The inevitable conclusion. A surviving member of Roderick's band, Thomas the Miller, testified, "We knew by week 5 that the grain would run out." Roderick knew too. He stopped eating, said he was fasting for victory. Really, he was trying to stretch supplies. But you can't lead starving men if you look fed. When the last grain was gone, we looked at him still healthier than us, despite his fasting, and made the only logical decision. He'd fed us for 6 weeks with wheat. He'd fed us for 3 more days with himself. These frost lords emerged everywhere, their tiny kingdoms rising and falling like waves. A tax collector with a hidden cache became Lord of Calais for 11 days. A merchant who'd hoarded salt pork ruled Antwerp for a month. A priest who'd discovered Roman-era grain stores in ancient ruins declared himself Pope King of Regensburg, and lasted 2 months before his congregation ate him during what they called the True Communion. The Bishop of Strasbourg's account of Lord Wilhelm provides the most detailed description of how these micro-kingdoms operated. Wilhelm had been nobody, a third son of a minor lord, trained for priesthood but turned soldier. When the famine began, he was guarding a river crossing that nobody used anymore. But beneath that crossing, in caves known only to smugglers, lay tons of preserved food from decades of illegal trade. Wilhelm emerged from obscurity like a demon from ice, the bishop wrote. One day unknown, the next commanding 500 men who called him Caesar. He built a frozen empire on dried fish and pickled cabbage, demanding absolute obedience in exchange for daily rations. He held court on a throne made from frozen corpses, dispensing justice measured in mouthfuls of food. Wilhelm's system was sophisticated for a frost lord. He created a complex hierarchy based on usefulness. Soldiers who brought back food from raids received double rations. Craftsmen who could maintain weapons got standard portions. The elderly and weak got quarter rations, enough to keep them alive as emergency food supplies, though this was never stated explicitly. He even minted his own currency, wooden tokens stamped with a wheat symbol. 1 token, 1 meal. The tokens became more valuable than gold in his territory. People murdered for them. Families sold children for them. The tokens were power crystallized into wood. But Wilhelm made the classic Frostlord mistake, he believed. His own mythology. He started eating more, justifying it as maintaining strength for leadership. He took multiple women as wives, claiming he was breeding a new nobility for the post-famine world. He built a palace from commandeered timber. While his followers sheltered in ruins, he grew fat while they grew thinner. The end came in March 1318. His captain, Hans Württemberg, later testified to church authorities. We could see his belly growing while ours shrank. He wore furs while we froze. He spoke of the kingdom we were building while we died building it. When the last preserved meat was distributed, none to us, all to his wives, we knew what had to be done. They didn't just kill Wilhelm, they ritualized it. They held a mock trial where he was accused of hoarding flesh while others had none. They sentenced him to share his flesh as he should have shared his food. They cooked him slowly, keeping him alive as long as possible, making him watch as they ate pieces of him. His screams, the bishop recorded, could be heard in Strasbourg. Across the frozen Rhine, the French crown attempted to reassert control but found their armies dissolving. Upon contact with frost lords, royal soldiers would desert en masse when offered food by local warlords. The Constable of France reported to King Philip V, "I departed Paris with 2,000 men. I arrived at Orleans with 200. The rest did not desert. They simply found new masters who could feed them. A kingdom cannot compete with a kitchen." The Holy Roman Emperor faced even worse. His imperial army, once the terror of Europe, simply ceased to exist. The Chronicle of Augsburg records, "The emperor sent orders to mobilize his forces. The messengers returned with laughter." What forces? His generals had become frost lords. His soldiers had become bandits. His authority extended exactly as far as his personal guards could walk before collapsing from hunger. England's Edward II tried a different approach, officially recognizing frost lords as legitimate authorities if they swore fealty. The result was chaos. Hundreds of petty warlords claimed royal sanction while fighting each other. The Earl of Lancaster wrote, "The king has legitimized anarchy. Every man with a barn full of turnips now styles himself Lord Protector of something. Some frost lords created elaborate justifications for their rule. Baron Friedrich the Mad claimed God spoke to him through the patterns of frost on windows, dictating who should eat and who should fast. Lord Jacques of Normandy insisted he was the reincarnation of Charlemagne, returned to lead France through darkness. Count Stanislas of Mazovia declared himself the Emperor of Winter and demanded tribute in the form of human flesh, claiming it was the only meat that wouldn't spoil. The battles between frost lords were unlike traditional warfare. They fought not for territory but for carries. Sieges were impossible. The besiegers would starve before the besieged. Cavalry charges were fanticide the horses had been eaten. Battles were brief, vicious affairs where starving men fought over rumors of food. A typical battle might involve 100 men fighting to the death over a storehouse. That turned out to contain only rotted turnips. The Chronicle of Cologne describes one such conflict. Lord Henrik's men met Lord Dietrich's at the frozen mill. They fought for 6 hours in the snow, men dying from cold as much as combat. The winners found 3 sacks of mouldy rebellion enough to feed them for the march home. 43 died for perhaps 43 meals. This is the mathematics of the winter wars. Naval warfare ceased entirely. Ships required crews, crews required food, and any ship with food became a target for its own sailors. The entire English fleet in Portsmouth was found in spring 1318, with the officers eaten and the common sailors gone, having sailed to wherever they imagined food might exist. Most likely, they ate each other at sea. The mercenary companies that had plagued Europe for decades transformed into something worse. No longer fighting for pay, they fought for food itself. The Free Company of the Wolf, led by a former priest called Father Fang, became notorious for their practice of recruitment. They would attack villages, eat the weak, and force the strong to join them. Their ranks swelled with the desperate and depleted with the digested. The most successful frost lord was arguably Margaret the Terrible, a former abbess who controlled grain stores across 3 monasteries. She ruled for 8 months in eternity in frost lord terms by being utterly ruthless. She fed her followers just enough to keep them loyal, but not enough to make them strong. She rotated guards constantly so none could organize rebellion. She had tasters for her food, but the tasters were different each meal. Chosen by lottery, her end came not from rebellion, but from mathematics. She calculated she could survive another month on remaining stores. Her followers calculated she was the only remaining store. They didn't kill her quickly like Wilhelm. They kept her alive, locked in her own granary, taking small pieces when needed. She lived for 3 weeks as a conscious larder, her brilliant mind intact enough to appreciate the irony. By summer 1318, most frost lords were dead. They're tiny. Kingdoms dissolved into memory and meat, but they had served a horrific purpose. They had organized the chaos of starvation into structured systems of consumption. They had turned random death into regulated death. They had made the unbearable bearable by giving it hierarchy and meaning. A surviving chronicle summarizes the winter wars perfectly. Nations require shared purpose. Kingdoms need common cause. But in the frozen years, the only shared purpose was survival. The only common cause was calories. Every man became his own nation, every grain store its own kingdom. We didn't have wars between countries, we had wars between kitchens. And in the end, every king became a meal. But nothing compares to what happened in the winter of 1319. In villages across Germany, something unprecedented occurred. The children left, not taken, not sold. They simply walked away into the snow, hundreds of them, following. A 12-year-old girl named Margareta, who claimed she knew where summer was hiding. Parents were too weak to stop them. Some say too relieved. The children marched south, singing hymns, leaving tiny, frozen footprints. They believed if they could reach Rome, they could convince God to bring back the sun. A merchant traveling to Venice reported seeing them, a line of small shadows against the white, moving like sleepwalkers. I offered them bread. They refused. The girl at the front said they were already full of winter and kept walking. They never reached Rome. A woodcutter found them in an alpine pass the following spring. Hundreds of small bodies perfectly preserved in ice, still holding hands. Still walking formation. Still heading south toward a summer that would never come. Margareta of Hamelin. Was nobody special before the winter of 1319? The baker's daughter? Middle child of 7? Known only for her strange habit of speaking to sparrows that no longer existed? But in January 1319, something changed. She began telling other children about dreams where summer lived in a golden palace beyond the mountains, imprisoned by winter demons, waiting for children pure enough to free it. The priest of Hamelin, Father Ernst, recorded the beginning. The girl stands in the square each dawn, speaking of summer as if it were a person. She describes the taste of strawberries to children who have never seen fruit. She tells them about flowers, what colors they were, how they smelled. Children who were born during the famine, who know only grey and white and cold, listen to her like she's describing paradise. At first, adults dismissed it as childhood fantasy, a coping mechanism for horror. Let the children dream of summer while they starved in winter. But Margareta's stories grew more elaborate, more specific. She claims summer sent her messages through ice patterns on windows. She said she could hear summer crying, trapped behind the wall of winter, begging to be freed. Summer is not gone, she preached to growing crowds of children. Summer is captured. The adults are too heavy with sin to rescue it. But we, children, light with innocence, can slip through winter's fingers and bring summer home. The theology was childish but compelling. Adults had caused the famine through their wars, their greed, their sins. Children were innocent victims. Therefore, children could be innocent saviors. The logic of a 12-year-old mind, but to other 12-year-olds it was revelation. By February, Margareta had hundreds of followers, all children between the ages of 4 and 14. They met in secret, practicing for their journey. They would walk to Rome, she said, where God's representative lived. They would demand, not ask, demand that the Pope release Summer from its prison. If he refused, they would find Summer themselves. The preparation was heartbreaking in its innocence. Children stole their parents' shoes, too large for tiny feet, stuffing them with straw. They made summer cloaks from stolen blankets, decorated with charcoal drawings of flowers they'd never seen. They practiced walking in formation, the older children carrying the younger, believing that unity would protect them from winter's grasp. Hans Müller, a traveling merchant, encountered them preparing. They train like an army of ghosts. 8-year-olds teaching 4-year-olds how to walk through snow. They share imaginary food, practicing for when they'll have real food again. The girl Margareta watches them with eyes too old for her face. She knows, I think. She knows where this leads. But she continues anyway. Parents were paralyzed by impossible mathematics. Stop your children from leaving and watch them starve slowly at home. Let them leave and maybe, possibly, they find food elsewhere. Or at least they die with hope instead of despair. The mayor of Hamelin wrote, "We cannot feed them. We cannot save them. If they wish to walk to their deaths, is that worse than sitting to their deaths? At least walking gives the illusion of agency." Some parents actively encouraged their children to join. Widow Brown pushed her 3 sons toward Margareta, saying, "Follow her to summer or heaven, whichever comes first." Johann the smith told his daughter, "Better to die seeking warmth than to freeze knowing warmth will never come." On February 28, 1319, they left. 312 children walked out of Hamelin at dawn, singing a hymn Margareta had taught. Them, summer sleeps beyond the mountain, dreams of green in halls of white. We shall wake it with our walking, turn the darkness into light. They were joined by children from every village they passed. Rothenburg added 50. Wurzburg contributed 70. Nuremberg, despite the mayor's attempts to stop them, lost nearly 200 children in a single night. By the time they reached Augsburg, the procession numbered over 1,000. The Bishop of Augsburg tried to stop them, blocking the road with armed guards. Margareta walked up to him, this 12-year-old girl facing the church's authority, and said, "You can kill us. Here or let us die seeking salvation. Either way, our blood is on your hands. But if we die seeking, at least we die with purpose." The bishop, shamed by a child, let them pass. He later wrote, "I should have stopped them. But stopping them would have meant admitting there was nothing to seek, no hope to find, no summer waiting anywhere. I let them pass because their delusion was kinder than my truth." The procession grew stranger as it moved south. Children who could no longer walk were pulled on makeshift sleds. Those who died were not left behind. The others carried frozen corpses, believing they would revive when summer was found. They ate snow exclusively, claiming Margareta had blessed it to sustain them. Many believed they were already dead, that this was their soul's journey to paradise. A monk traveling north met them near Innsbruck. They moved like a river of small ghosts, their singing echoing off mountain walls. The girl at the front no longer walks, she floats, carried by older children who believe touching the ground would break the spell. I offered them shelter in our monastery. They refused, saying walls would trap them in winter forever. The merchant, Giuseppe Di Marco, returning to Venice from Germany, provided the last confirmed sighting, a line of shadows against the alpine snow. Still walking, still singing, though the song now sounds like wind through empty houses. The leader, a girl, her lips blue with cold, but still moving in prayer or madness. I offered bread, real bread, not imagination. She looked at me with eyes already seeing another world and said, "We are already full of winter. We need no earthly food." They walked past me into the mounting storm, and I swear before God they seemed to fade rather than depart, becoming one with the blizzard itself. They never emerged from the Alps. Search parties sent when spring finally came found them in a high pass, preserved perfectly in ice. They had died walking, still in formation, still holding hands. The smaller children carried by the larger, all facing south toward an Italy they would never see, a Rome they would never reach, a summer that had never been imprisoned except in the desperate imagination of a 12-year-old girl. Margaretto was found at the front, her face turned skyward, arms outstretched as if embracing something invisible. In her frozen hand, a piece of parchment with a single line. Summer was inside us all along, but winter was stronger. The bodies were left where they lay. The Archbishop of Salzburg declared the site sacred ground, saying, "They died as pilgrims, seeking God's warmth. Let them remain as monuments to faith or folly, no longer know the difference." But the story doesn't end with their deaths. When spring finally came in 1322, when the famine finally broke, wildflowers grew in unusual abundance along the route the children had walked. Skeptics said it was from the organic matter their bodies had left. Believers said it was summer finally answering their call, 3 years too late. Parents who had let their children go lived with mathematical grief. They had solved the equation of survival by subtracting their offspring. Most went mad. The baker of Hamelin, Margaret's father, spent his remaining years making bread he would leave outside his shop each dawn for when the children returned from summer. He died calling Margaretta's name, swearing he could hear her singing. The children's crusade of frost became mythology before the last body was found. Some claimed the children had found summer and stayed there, unable to return. Others said they had become the spirits of winter, doomed to walk the Alps forever, searching for warmth that doesn't exist. A few insisted they had seen the children in dreams, playing in fields of grain, finally warm, finally fed, finally free. A chronicler in Vienna wrote the definitive epitaph. They were children who had never known spring, following a child who dreamed of summer, seeking a warmth that had died before they were born. They walked to their deaths with more purpose than most live their lives. They failed to find summer, but they succeeded in escaping winter, which may have been the only success possible. The children's crusade of frost represents the absolute nadir of the Great Famine, not the death of hope, but hope itself becoming death's agent. When children abandon their parents to seek impossible dreams, when parents let them go knowing the truth, when entire societies watch their future walk away into frozen oblivion and do nothing because nothing can be done, that is when civilization doesn't just collapse but voluntarily dissolves. Yet there's something else in this story. Something that explains why it haunted Europe for generations. Those children, doomed and deluded, chose their fate. In a world where death was certain, they chose to die seeking rather than waiting. They wrote their own ending rather than having it written for them. They failed, but they failed attempting the impossible, which is perhaps the most human thing one can do. The last word belongs to a nameless child, one of hundreds found in that alpine pass, who had carved into a frozen tree trunk. We came to find summer. We found each other. That is enough. By 1320, something unprecedented was happening across Europe. Entire villages were disappearing. Not dying, disappearing. A tax collector would arrive to find homes standing empty. Fires still warm, food still on tables, but not a soul in sight. Bishop of Lincoln investigated 17 such villages. His report contains a chilling observation. In each dwelling we found the same thing, a single word carved into the main beam. Forgiven. We know not if they sought forgiveness or granted it. Modern archaeologists have found evidence these villagers walked en masse into forests, bogs, or the sea. Mass suicide? Mass migration to nowhere? We'll never know. But the pattern was always identical. They left everything behind except their children. The children, it seems, they took with them to whatever end they chose. The first documented vanishing was Thornwick, a village of 200 souls in Yorkshire. The king's tax collector, William de Vere, arrived on March 15, 1320, to find smoke still rising from chimneys, but no one to tend the fires. His report to the crown reads like a ghost story. The village stands as if frozen in a moment. Bread half-eaten on tables. Needlework abandoned mid-stitch. A pot of porridge still warm over dying embers. But of people nothing. Not even bodies. They have vanished as completely as if God himself erased them from existence. But they hadn't been erased. They had chosen erasure. In every house, carved deep into the main support beam, that single word, forgiven. Some carved carefully, with time and purpose. Others scratched hastily, as if in final moments before departure. All in different hands, but all the same word. The Bishop of Lincoln. Thomas Beckhampton was sent to investigate when 7 more villages in his diocese reported similar vanishings. His investigation team included scribes, soldiers, and physicians. What they found challenged their understanding of human behavior. We tracked them, the bishop wrote. 200 people cannot vanish without trace. We found footprints leading from the village, all together, walking in the same direction. Men, women, children, elderly, every soul that could walk had walked. Those who couldn't walk had been carried. The tracks led to Sherwood Forest and then ... stopped. Not scattered, not turned back. Simply stopped, as if they had stepped off the earth itself. Deeper investigation revealed planning. These weren't spontaneous disappearances, but coordinated evacuations. In Thornwick, they found evidence of a final feast. Everyone had eaten together one last time, using the last of their stores. In Grimsby, they discovered that villagers had released all livestock, opened all gates, freed all caged birds. They had systematically undone civilization before walking away from it. The physician, Master Hugh of Salerno, noted something disturbing. No. Signs of violence? No evidence of force. These people chose to leave. More troubling, they chose together. What conversation, what collective decision leads an entire community to abandon existence itself? The pattern spread across Europe like a plague of absence. In Bavaria, the village of Klinwald vanished, leaving behind a communal letter. We go to find what God has hidden from us. We go together because alone we are nothing. We take our children because they deserve better than this slow death. We leave our homes because homes without hope are merely tombs with windows. Seek us not. We are already farther than you can follow. The French village of Moulambus left more disturbing evidence. Every adult had written their name on the church wall, followed by their sins: murder, theft, adultery, cannibalism. The last entry in the priest's hand: we have all sinned beyond redemption. We go to place ourselves before God's judgment directly, rather than wait for him to find us here. But it was the German village of Hofnungslos that provided the most complete picture. They had left a chronicle, written collectively, each family, contributing a passage: we have eaten our horses, we have eaten our dogs, we have eaten our leather, we have eaten our dead, we have eaten hope itself. What remains is not life, but the mockery of life. We choose to end this mockery on our own terms. The Muller family counts 5 souls still breathing. We have survived by unspeakable acts. Our youngest no longer speaks. Our eldest no longer sleeps. We are alive, but not living. Tomorrow we walk toward whatever judgment awaits. I am Klaus the smith. I have beaten plowshares into weapons, weapons into tools, tools into nothing. My hammer has nothing left to strike. My forge has nothing left to burn. I have nothing left to be. We go to become nothing together. The entries. Continued 4 pages. Each family's testament to horror endured and horror committed. The final entry, unsigned. We forgive each other because no one else will. We forgive ourselves because we must. We forgive God because he knows not what he does. The children were always taken. This detail haunted investigators. In villages where adults were found dead from starvation, disease, violence, children's bodies were often present. But in the vanished villages, no children remained. Whatever dark pilgrimage these communities undertook, they brought their young. A woodcutter named Franz claimed to have seen one such procession near the Black Forest. 300 shadows walking into the trees at dusk. No talking, no crying. Even the babes silent in their mother's arms. They walked like they were already dead, just looking for a place to lie down. I called out, but none turned. They walked into the forest, and the forest swallowed them. The church struggled to explain the vanishings. Suicide was mortal sin, but was this suicide? The Archbishop of Canterbury wrote, "If a man throws himself from a cliff, it is suicide. If a village walks into the sea, what is it? Mass suicide? Or something else, a collective return to the nothing from which we came?" In Paris, 1321, while peasants gnawed bark, the nobility held what historians call the most disturbing party in medieval history, the Feast of Fools. Organized by Count Robert of Artois, it was meant as defiance against death. Here's what happened. Nobles dressed as peasants, peasants dressed as nobles. They served courses of elaborately prepared nothing, empty plates dressed with garnishes of straw. They held mock executions where the condemned gave recipes for cooking leather. They crowned a skeleton as May Queen, but the climax was the last. Supper 13 nobles drew lots. The one who drew the black stone would provide the feast. Count Robert drew it himself. He laughed, opened his veins into wine cups, and served his blood to his guests while making toasts. He bled to death. Standing, cup raised, still smiling. The chronicle states, none stopped drinking until the cup was empty. The invitation had arrived on vellum worth more than most Parisians would see in a lifetime, written in gold ink that could have been traded for bread. Count Robert of Artois requests your presence at the Feast of Fools, where we shall dine. On reality and drink deep of truth. Come as you are not, leave as you never were. April 1st, year of our absent Lord 1321. Count Robert had survived the famine through typical noble privileged hoarded grain, fortified walls, the ability to take from those who couldn't resist. But something had broken in him when his youngest daughter died not from starvation, but from abundance. She'd found his hidden honey store, eaten herself to rupture, died vomiting sweetness while Paris starved. He'd laughed when they found her body, and hadn't stopped laughing since. The feast's preparation was elaborate insanity. Robert spent the last of his wealth on decorations for serving nothing. He commissioned golden plates for emptiness, silver, chalices for air, elaborate centerpieces celebrating absence. The great hall of his chateau was transformed into what witnesses called a cathedral of mockery. Lady Isabelle de Valois, who survived the feast, left the most complete account. We arrived to find reality inverted. Servants sat at the high tableware in our clothes rob had demanded we exchange garments at the door. We nobles served them, dressed in rags that stank of death. But the servants were more disturbed than we. They knew this game could only end badly for them. First course was soup of memories. Empty bowls filled only with steam from heated stones. Guests were required to describe what they tasted. Duke Philippe claimed he tasted his mother's fish stew. Countess Marie swore she could taste strawberries. Baron Henry said he tasted his own death and was asked to be more specific about the flavoring. Robert presided over this madness dressed as death himself, black robes, skull mask, scythe resting against his chair. But he'd modified the costume. Death wore a crown of bread loaves, molded and painted gold, technically edible but deliberately withheld. Death is the only one eating well these days, he announced, so I dressed appropriately. The second course was meat of mathematics, elaborately garnished platters containing nothing but written equations. If one person eats for 3 days, 3 people eat for 1 day, or 9 people eat for 4 hours. Solve for X, where X equals survival. Guests were required to eat the paper, chewing their calculations, swallowing their arithmetic. The Duke of Orleans choked on a particularly complex formula involving compound interest in human flesh. Between courses, entertainment. A troupe of starving actors performed the tragedy of abundance, a play where King Midas starved surrounded by golden food. Halfway through, one actor actually collapsed mid-soliloquy. The audience applauded, thinking it was part of the performance. When they realized he was truly dead, they applauded louder. The third course, fish of philosophy. Servants brought paintings of fish, beautifully rendered, while Count Robert delivered a lecture on the nature of reality. Is a painting of a fish less real than a fish? Can you eat either in these times? At least the painting doesn't rot. Art has become more substantial than substance. Then came the mock trials. Guests took turns being executed for the crime of survival. Each condemned had to share their worst act, their method of staying alive. The Duchess of Berry admitted to eating her own stillborn infant. The Count of Nevers confessed to walling up servants with grain stores so he wouldn't be tempted to share. The Bishop of Parisiaz, a bishop attended, revealed he'd been giving last rites with unconsecrated hosts because he'd eaten all the blessed ones. Each confession was met with mock judgment. Guilty of humanity, Robert would declare. Sentenced to continued existence. The crowd would laugh, but it was laughter like screaming, laughter like sobbing. Laughter because the alternative was acknowledging what they'd all become. The fourth course was vegetables of vanity, sculptures made from human hair and nail. Clippings arranged to look like salads. We consume ourselves, Robert explained. We always have. The famine just made it literal. Guests were required to eat these too. The Marquis de Toulouse vomited immediately. He was forced to eat that as well. Nothing wasted, Robert insisted. That's the new nobility. The entertainment grew darker. A puppet show where marionettes made from human bones performed a harvest dance. A choir of orphans singing recipes for preparing leather. A juggler tossing skulls who revealed, mid-performance, that they were his own children's skulls. The audience couldn't tell what was performance and what was confession. The fifth course, bread of betrayal. Actual bread appeared, one small loaf. The room went silent. Real food, after hours of elaborate nothing. Roberts explained the game. Tell us who you killed for food. The best story wins the bread. What followed was an auction of atrocity. The Baron of Anjou described smothering his elderly mother to inherit her hidden grain. The Countess of Blois explained how she'd poisoned her husband when she discovered he'd been secretly eating while she starved. The Duke of Normandy won with his tale of hosting a dinner party, serving his guests his own son, then revealing the truth after they'd eaten. He took one bite of the bread and vomited blood. The bread was made from sawdust and painted to look real. The sixth course, wine of wisdom. Empty goblets that guests had to fill with their own fluid stares, saliva, blood, whatever they could produce. We toast to truth, Robert declared. The truth that we are bags of liquid pretending to have purpose. They drank their own essences while Robert laughed and laughed and laughed. Then came the moment that would define the feast in history. Robert announced the Last Supper, 13 volunteers to recreate Christ's final meal, but with a twist. They would draw lots. 12 would feast. 1 would be the feast. The volunteers came forward, 12 nobles, so broken by horror they'd embrace any ending. Robert himself was the 13th. They drew carved bones from a jeweled box. Robert palmed the black bone, ensuring he drew it. Everyone knew. No one spoke. I am the feast, he announced with genuine joy. I am bread and wine. I am flesh and blood. I am the only honest noble lefty. Give myself to be consumed. He opened his veins with ceremonial precision, not to die quickly, but to fill 13 cups. He made toasts as his blood flowed to abundance. Nervous laughter to the feast that never ends. Desperate drinking to the truth that we're all already dead. Silence, except for swallowing. He conducted himself like a sommelier describing vintages. Note the iron undertones, the hint of despair, the full body of wasted life. He grew paler with each toast, but never stopped smiling. Drink deep, friends. I'm a vintage that won't be repeated. The guests drank because stopping would mean acknowledging what they were doing. They drank because Robert was watching, still standing, still bleeding, still insisting this was all a grand joke. They drank because his blood was warm and they'd forgotten warmth. They drank because it was that or scream. Robert's final toast, as his knees began to buckle, to the feast of fools, where fools feast on fools, where wisdom is folly and folly is survival. To the nobility that dies with nobility, leaving only animals wearing crowns. To the joke that God played on us, and the joke we play back. To the end that never ends, and the ending that never he fell forward. Cup still raised, smile still, fixed. Dead before he hit the ground, but somehow still laughing. The guests sat with empty cups, full stomachs, and the knowledge that they'd literally drunk noble blood while dressed as peasants in a world where symbolism had become sustenance. The aftermath was swift and terrible. The servants, forced to watch nobles drink noble blood, revolted, not politically aside. They stripped off the noble clothes, fled the chateau, most walking directly into the Seine to drown. The nobles, trapped in servant rags, covered in Robert's blood, stumbled into Paris streets where they were attacked by mobs who didn't recognize them or didn't care. Of the 100 guests at the Feast of Fools, 13 survived to Easter. Most died by suicide, unable to process what they'd participated in. Lady Isabel, who recorded the events, ended her account. We went to mock death and became death's mockery. We tried to feast on nothing and discovered we were nothing. Count Robert won his game. He died laughing at a joke only he understood, leaving us to live with the punchline. The Feast of Fools wasn't just noble decadence, it was aristocracy's suicide note written in performance art, when the highest class of society serves nothing on golden plates, crowns, corpses, and drinks human blood as entertainment. The social order hasn't just collapsed, has performed its own autopsy while still breathing. The king, upon hearing of the feast, reportedly said, "Count Robert has shown us our future elaborate rituals around nothing, performances of power without power. Substance, consumption of ourselves disguised as celebration." He then ordered all records of the feast destroyed. They survived because Lady Isabel hid her account inside a Bible, writing, "Let future generations know that when the world ended, the nobility threw a party. We dressed our doom in silk and served our destruction on silver platters. We made horror into art because art was all we had left. And when the last toast was raised, it was to our own annihilation, delivered with perfect etiquette." Let me share numbers that medieval minds couldn't comprehend. In 1310, Europe's population was roughly 75 million. By 1322, it was 60 million. 15 million people gone. Not from plague, not from war, from cold and hunger, but statistics hide. Individual horror. In the town of Ypres, they kept exact records. Population 1315, 10,400. Population 1,322, 2,100. But here's the detail that haunts. Of those 2,100 survivors, only 300 were the original residents. The others, they came from elsewhere, drawn by rumors of food, only to find more death. The prior of Ypres wrote, We no longer bury the dead. We stack them like cordwood, waiting for spring. But spring never comes warm enough to dig. The numbers tell a story that words cannot. The Abbey of Saint Denis kept meticulous death records, originally for prayers for the departed. By 1318, they'd stopped recording names, just tally marks. 5 marks crossed through. 5 marks crossed through. Pages and pages of groups of 5, like a child learning to count, except each mark was a human soul. Brother Felipe, the abbey's mathematician, calculated the rate of death. In 1315, we lost 1 soul per week. By 1316, 1 per day. By 1317, 1 per hour. By 1318, we stopped counting because the living were too few to count the dead. Mathematics itself collapsed when the numbers exceeded comprehension. The Italian city-states, with their banking traditions, kept the most precise records. Florence's census of 1310 recorded 120,000 souls. The census of 1322 recorded 45,000. But hidden in those numbers was darker arithmetic. Of the 45,000 survivors, 30,000 had arrived during the famine, refugees from the countryside. The original Florentine population had dropped from 120,000 to 15,000. 7 of every 8 natives had perished. Venice's records reveal the geographic mathematics of death. The city's famous districts died at different rates. San Marco, where the wealthy lived, lost 40% of its population. Castello, where the poor crowded, lost 85%. But here's the cruel irony: the wealthy districts died faster in the final years. Once money meant nothing, poverty became an advantage. The poor knew how to starve. The rich only knew how to eat. In England, the Doomsday Book had recorded settlements since 1086. By comparing tax records from 1310 to 1322, we can track village-level devastation. In Norfolk, 40% of villages recorded in 1310 no longer existed. By 1322, not depopulated, erased. The land itself forgot humans had ever lived there. But let's look deeper at Ypres, because their obsessive record-keeping reveals the true mathematics of societal collapse. The town's cloth guild recorded not just deaths, but causes. 1,315. 500 deaths to 400 starvation. 100 disease 1316. 1,200 deaths to 900 starvation. 200 disease. 100 violence 1317. 2,100 deaths to 1,000 starvation. 500 disease, 400 violence. 200 voluntary 1318. 2,500 deaths to 800 starvation. 600 disease, 700 violence. 400 voluntary 1319. 1,800 deaths to 300 starvation. 400 disease, 500 violence. 600 voluntary 1,320. 900 deaths minus 100 starvation. 200 disease, 200 violence. 400 voluntary. See the pattern. As starvation deaths decreased because the weakest had already died, violence and suicide increased. The mathematics of survival had shifted from competing for food to eliminating competitors. The demographic breakdown is equally telling. By age, infants 0 to 2, 95% mortality children 3 to 12, 80% mortality young adults 13 to 25, 60% mortality, adults, 26 to 45. 70% mortality, elderly, 46 plus, 90%. Mortality, the young adults survive best old enough to fight, young enough to endure. Children and elderly died first, too weak to compete. But adults in their prime died at higher rates than young adults. Why? They had families. They gave their food to their children, starved themselves for others. Love was mathematically lethal. The gender mathematics were brutal. In 1315, Ypres had roughly equal numbers of men and women. By 1322, there were 3 men for every woman. Not because women were weaker, because women fed their children first, their husbands second, themselves last. Maternal sacrifice showed clearly in the survival statistics. The social class mathematics defied expectations. Nobility, 60% mortality clergy, 50% mortality merchants, 70% mortality craftsmen, 75% mortality peasants, 80% mortality beggars, 40% mortality beggars. Survived best. They already knew how to live on nothing. The nobility, despite their resources, died from inability to adapt. Merchants died because their profession became meaningless. But beggars, they thrived in a world that had become universal beggary. The geographic distribution created what scholars called death shadows. Cities drew refugees from the countryside, creating rings of escalating mortality. Paris, with a 1310 population of 200,000, had 80,000 survivors in 1322. But the villagers within a day's walk of Paris, complete annihilation. They'd all walked to the city seeking food, died in the streets, their homes becoming ghost towns. The monastery of Cluny mapped deaths across their network of abbeys. They discovered death followed trade routes not because trade spread disease, but because rumors of food traveled along merchant paths. Entire populations would migrate toward imagined abundance, creating waves of mobile starvation that crashed against city walls. The seasonal mathematics were predictable yet horrifying. Spring, highest death rates, bodies hidden by snow revealed. Last stores exhausted summer, moderate deaths, some forage available. But disease spread autumn. Lowest deaths, whatever harvest existed, plus weakest already dead winter. Rising deaths, cold, multiplying hungers, lethality, but within those seasons. Specific dates showed spikes. Christmas saw mass suicides. The contrast between religious celebration and reality broke minds. Easter saw violence spiked, the promise of resurrection mocked by death's omnipresence. Harvest festivals became killing fields as communities fought over failed crops. The birth rate mathematics were perhaps most tragic. In 1310, Ypres recorded 400 births. In 1316 to 200 births. In 1318, 50 births. In 1320, 12 births. By 1321, 0. Not 0, recorded 0, occurred. Women stopped conceiving, bodies too starved to support pregnancy. Those who did conceive miscarried, or gave birth to stillborn children. An entire generation unborn. The marriage mathematics inverted. In 1310, Ypres recorded 200 marriages. In 1320, they recorded 400. Why the increase during horror? Survival partnerships. Widows with food marrying widowers with shelter. Children married to combined family resources. Marriage became merger. Love replaced by mathematics. The death-to-burial ratio reveals societal collapses. Progression to 1,315. 1 death equals 1 burial, 1316. 2 deaths equals 1 burial, 1317. 5 deaths equals 1 burial, 1318. 10 deaths equals 1 burial, 1319. 20 deaths equals 1 burial, 1320. Burial ceased. Bodies stacked or burned. The prior of Ypres wrote, "We have built pyramids of the dead, frozen corpses stacked like masonry, mortared with ice. Come spring, they will thaw and collapse, but by then, who will remain to care?" The economic mathematics were absurd. The price of wheat increased 2,000% between 1315 and 1320, but expressing it as percentage obscures the reality. In 1315, a penny bought a loaf. In 1320, a year's wages couldn't buy a crumb. Money became meaningless. The only currency was calories. Distance mathematics changed. In 1310, a healthy person could walk 20 miles per day. By 1320, survivors could manage perhaps 2 miles. The world shrank as human capability decreased. Villages 10 miles apart became unreachable foreign lands. Geography expanded as humans contracted. The theft mathematics reveal moral collapse. 1,315. 100 thefts. Mostly grain, 1316. 500 thefts. Anything. Edible, 1317. 1,000 thefts. Including clothing and fuel, 1318. 2,000 thefts. Including children, 1319. Theft became meaningless. Nothing left to steal. The murder mathematics followed similar patterns, but with a crucial difference. Murders peaked in 1318, then declined not from returning morality, but from lack of strength. By 1319, people were too weak to kill. Violence required carries nobody could spare. The migration mathematics created empty zones and death clusters. Rural areas emptied as survivors walked to cities. Cities became graveyards as refugees died in streets. The population didn't just decline, it concentrated, then collapsed. Like a star becoming a black hole, the linguistic mathematics were subtle but telling. The Ypres records showed declining vocabulary over time. 1315 records use varied, complex language. By 1320, the same. Scribes used perhaps 200 words repeatedly. Hunger had literally reduced their ability to think in complex terms. Survival required all cognitive resources. The time mathematics warped reality. Survivors reported years feeling like decades, days feeling like minutes. The prior wrote, "We have lived 7 years that feel like 70. I am 40 but feel 400. Time itself has starved, moving slowly like everything else dying." The children's mathematics were most heartbreaking. In 1315, Ypres had 3,000 children under 12. By 1322, 45. Of those 45, only 3 were from Ypres. The others were orphans who'd wandered in from elsewhere. Their origins unknown, their parents dead, their futures non-existent. An entire generation deleted. Here's the mathematical truth medieval minds couldn't grasp. Exponential death. When food production drops 50%, population doesn't drop 50%, drops 80%. Because that 50% reduction creates competition, disease, violence, and suicide that multiply mortality beyond the initial cause. Famine doesn't just kill through starvation, it kills through the mathematics of social collapse. The final statistic, the one that captures the true horror of the 15 million who died. Historians estimate only 5 million died directly from starvation. The other 10 million died from what starvation created: disease, violence, suicide, exposure, accidents caused by weakness, childbirth without resources, infections without medicine. 2/3 of deaths weren't from famine, but from famine's mathematics. The prior of Ypres' final entry, dated March 1322. I have kept these records for 7 years. I have reduced human souls to marks on parchment, lives to numbers, horror to mathematics. But mathematics cannot capture the sound of children crying for food that doesn't exist. Cannot calculate the weight of watching your family die by degrees. Cannot solve for why God allows such equations. The numbers say 2,100 remain from 10,400. But numbers lie. None remain. We 2,100 are not survivors, we are the not yet dead. Walking statistics waiting for our final tally. Mathematics has proven that hell is not fire and brimstone. Hell is subtraction without end, division without remainder, the null set of human hope. In 1321, as the worst seemed to be passing, something strange happened. The rats returned, but they were different, larger, bolder, moving in coordinated swarms. A chronicler in Milan wrote, "They fear neither cat nor dog nor man. They walk in daylight like they own the earth." Where had they been for 7 years? Some scholars believe they survived in the vast granaries of Eastern Europe, growing fat while the West starved. Others think they evolved, adapted to the cold. But everyone agrees on one thing: they brought something back with them. A Venetian merchant noted, "The rats are sick. They dance in circles before dying, black swellings on their necks." Those swellings would have a name soon enough. But in 1321, as Europe began to believe the worst was over, nobody knew they were witnessing the overture to the Black Death. The first documented sighting was in Prague, March 1321. A baker named Joseph, one of the few whose ovens still functioned, reported to the city guard. They came at dawn, hundreds of them, moving like water through the streets. But wrong. Rats don't move together like soldiers. These did. They ignored the few cats left alive. The cats ran from them. Within days, similar reports flooded in from across Europe. But these weren't the timid creatures that had vanished in 1315. The merchant Giovanni di Marco, traveling from Venice to Vienna, documented what he saw. Rats the size of rabbits, some larger, grey-black fur so thick arrows bounce off, eyes that reflect light like demons. They don't scatter when approached. They stand their ground, studying you, calculating. The Archbishop of Mainz received disturbing reports from his parishes. The rats show intelligence beyond nature. They work in teams, some distract while others steal. They've learned to open larches, untie knots, even use simple tools. A priest in Worms saw one using a stick to knock bread from a high shelf. This is not natural. This is diabolic. But where had they been? The 7-year absence created wild theories, but one Benedictine scholar, Brother Antonius of Regensburg, proposed something chillingly plausible. The rats didn't vanish, they migrated east, following ancient Roman grain routes to the steppes. Beyond Hungary, there, in the vast underground granaries, built by emperors and forgotten by time, they found paradise. Infinite grain, no predators, perfect breeding conditions, 7 years of unlimited food and reproduction. They've returned not as the same species, but as something evolved. The physical changes were documented obsessively. A physician in Paris dissected several specimens, twice the size of pre-famine rats. Muscle density increased by half. Teeth lengthened and serrated, capable of chewing through wood, even soft metals. Most disturbing, enlarged brains. The cranial capacity has increased by 1/3. These are not the rats that left. These are their descendants, shaped by 7 years of plenty while we endured 7 years of want. The behavioral changes were even more unsettling. The rats showed coordination that defied explanation. A witness in Cologne described an attack on a grain warehouse. They moved in waves. First wave gnawed the doors, while others waited. When guards appeared, they retreated. In perfect synchronization, they returned at night with more numbers, attacking from multiple points simultaneously. They knew we were watching. They waited until we were exhausted. They had lost all fear of humans. Previous generations of rats fled from people, lived in shadows, scavenged secretly. These new rats walked openly through marketplaces, entered homes while families ate, stared directly at humans with what witnesses described as calculating intelligence. A child in Nuremberg reported rats watching her family eat dinner through the window. "Counting us," she said. "The cats, those few that survived the famine, refused to hunt them." A chronicler in line observed. "Our best Mauser, who survived 7 years of horror by hunting, now cowers when rats pass. He recognizes something we don't. The predator-prey relationship is inverted. The cats know they're now the prey. Dogs fared no better. Hunting hounds trained to kill wolves ran from rat. Swarms. A pack of street dogs in Milan, hardened by years of surviving on corpses, was found torn apart. Witnesses said the rats had hunted them like wolves hunt deer, driving them into a corner, exhausting them, then moving in for the kill. But it was the rats' relationship with the dead that proved most disturbing. During the famine, corpses had accumulated faster than burial. Mass graves, body piles, frozen pyramids of the dead, all untouched for years. The returned rats showed intense interest in these sites. Not to feed, they seemed well fed, but to investigate. A gravedigger in Bordeaux reported. They dig into the mass graves, not eating, just ... examining. They spend hours among the bones, touching them with their paws, almost like they're reading something. Then they emerge and dance, spinning, leaping, falling over, getting up, spinning again, like they're drunk or mad. The dancing disease appeared first in the rats, then in the animals they bit, finally in humans. But in 1321, people thought it was just strange behavior. They didn't connect it to disease. Why would they? The rats looked healthy, even robust. Larger, stronger, more vital than any rats in memory. An Italian merchant named Carlo Benedetti made the crucial observation that historians would later recognize as prophetic. The rats congregate at trade routes, ports, and crossroads. There, not seeking food exists everywhere now that so few remain to eat it. They're positioning themselves along human movement patterns. Waiting, but for what? The rats showed particular interest in the remaining churches and monasteries. Brother Francis of Assisi documented their behavior. They enter during services, completely unafraid of the congregation. They sit in neat rows as if listening to the sermon. When we sing hymns, they sway. When we pray, they bow their heads. Mockery, mimicry, or something else. They seem to be waiting for something, some signal we cannot perceive. The first human deaths directly attributable to the returned rats came in summer 1321, not from attack from disease. A family in Bruges who'd been bitten while defending their grain store fell ill within days. The symptoms were unlike anything seen during the famine: high fever, delirium, and most distinctively, black swellings in the neck, armpits and groin. The family died within a week, but not before describing their hallucinations. The rats speak to us in dreams. They show us cities of the dead, kingdoms built in grave earth, empires of bone and plague. They promise us citizenship and then Acropolis if we stop fighting and accept the gift they bring. Medical professionals were baffled. A physician in Prague wrote, "The disease is nothing like the starvation, sickness, or winter plague. It burns through bodies like fire through dry wood. The black swellings appear where the body fights hardest, lymph nodes swelling with failed resistance. But, strangest of all, the victims dance before they die, just like the rats." The dancing sickness spread from the bitten to their families, from families to neighborhoods, from neighborhoods to districts. But in 1321, it was still contained, still rare. Most who died that year still died from famine's lingering effects. The new plague was just beginning its incubation, both in human bodies and human societies. The rats' intelligence manifested in increasingly complex ways. They learned to avoid traditional traps, poison, and hunting methods. They developed new social structures: scout rats who tested food for danger, guard rats who watched for threats, even what appeared to be leader rats who directed group movements through series of squeaks and gestures. A scholar in Vienna documented their learning capabilities. We captured one, intending study. Its companions spent 3 nights trying to free it, using increasingly sophisticated methods: leverage, distraction, even attempting to pick the lock with twisted metal. When they failed, they sat outside the cage in vigil until the captured rat died. Then they left. But the next night, our laboratory burned. The fire started in 3 places simultaneously. Draw your own conclusions. The church struggled to explain the rats' return. Were they demons? Punishments? Tests? The Bishop of Cologne preached. For 7 years they abandoned us to our suffering. Now they return in our moment of hope, stronger for their absence. They are either God's final curse or Satan's opening move in some greater game. Either way, they herald something worse than what we've endured. Popular folklore developed quickly. Rats were secret rulers of the underworld who'd retreated to plan humanity's destruction. They would transform human souls, twisted by starvation, into animal form. They were advanced scouts for an invasion from hell itself. Each theory was more fantastic than the last, but none were as terrible as the truth. The truth was biological, not theological. The rats had spent 7 years in isolated populations, breeding rapidly in the eastern granaries. Diseases that would normally kill them had instead created resistant populations. The Black Death bacterium, Yersinia pestis, had found perfect incubation conditions, countless hosts, rapid reproduction, isolation from human interference. The rats weren't evil. They were evolution's answer to abundance. After scarcity, by autumn. 1321, the dancing sickness had spread to every major city. Still not epidemic, still not recognized as connected to the rats, but growing. The correlation between rat populations and disease was noticed by a few. An Italian doctor wrote, "Where rats congregate, sickness follows. Where rats dance, humans die. Where rats thrive, plague arrives." But Europe, exhausted from 7 years of famine, couldn't process another catastrophe. The return of the rats was seen as disgusting but manageable. The dancing sickness was concerning but limited. Nobody connected the dots that would seem obvious in hindsight, that the rats weren't just returning from exile. They were bringing hell with them. The final observation of 1321 came from a child in Marseille, a girl who'd survived the famine by eating rats when they were still scarce. She told her priest, "The old rats tasted of hunger and fear. These new rats taste of death and patience. They're not afraid of us because they know something we don't. They're waiting for us to realize we're already dead." Within 20 years, her words would prove prophetic. The Black Death would kill 1/3 of Europe's remaining population. But in 1321, as people celebrated the famine's end, as they counted their dead and rebuilt their lives, the rats just watched, and waited, and danced their strange dances in the moonlight, practicing for the grand performance yet to come. On March 15, 1322, something miraculous happened. The sun broke through clouds that had shrouded Europe for 7 years. Real warmth, real light. In London, people fell to their knees in the streets, weeping. Church bells rang for 3 straight days. A young monk in Canterbury wrote, "We had forgotten the sun could hurt your eyes." Children who had never seen their own shadows screamed in terror at the dark shapes that followed them. But the thaw revealed horrors frozen in time. Bodies emerged from snowdrifts, perfectly preserved. Entire families found seated at tables. Frozen mid-meal. Armies discovered standing in formation, weapons raised, ice statues of a war that winter had won. The warmth came suddenly, without warning. Dawn broke grey as it had for 7 years. But by noon, actual golden light pierced through, not the weak, watery light that occasionally appeared, but real sunshine, hot, bright, alive. In Paris, people stumbled from their homes, shielding their eyes, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Marie de Champagne, age 7, born during the famine, experienced sunshine for the first time. Mother fell to her knees and pulled me down, saying we must pray. I asked what the burning light was. She said God's eye has opened. I was terrified. I thought God was going to see what we'd done to survive. The ice began to melt with alarming speed. Winter's archives, 7 years of frozen death, began to reveal themselves. In Cologne, the Rhine's thaw exposed a grotesque gallery, hundreds of bodies that had fallen through ice over the years, preserved perfectly, now floating downstream like a parade of the damned. Citizens lined the banks, searching for relatives lost years ago, finding them looking exactly as they had at death. Brother Thomas of Westminster, who'd chronicled the disaster from beginning, wrote with shaking hand, "The earth gives up its dead, but not for resurrection. They return only to show us what we've done." A mother and child, frozen in embrace, so perfectly preserved I could count the tears frozen on their cheeks. Soldiers who died defending grain stores, still standing at their posts, ice guardians of nothing. God has kept perfect record of our failures. But with the thaw came something worse than revealed corpse. Truth-field truth. The ice had hidden the full scope of devastation. Entire districts thought to be empty were found to contain hundreds of frozen dead. Mass graves, hastily covered with snow, began to melt and shift, creating mudslides of human remains. The spring of 1322 didn't bring renewal. It brought archaeology of horror in the Alps. The thaw revealed the children's crusade of frost, perfectly preserved. A merchant reported, "They stand like an army of small angels, ice blue and beautiful. In their death, still holding hands, still facing south, still seeking summer that has finally come too late. Pilgrims are already calling it holy ground. I call it the world's guilt made manifest. Europe that emerged from the Great Famine was unrecognizable. Languages had changed, words for hunger had multiplied, while words for joy had been forgotten. Children born during the 7 years were stunted, marked forever by starvation. They would be called the famine generation, shorter, weaker, but survivors of the impossible. The social order had shattered. Peasants who survived owned land, for the first time inherited from the dead. The church's authority collapsed where was God during the freeze. And most critically, the population drop created labor shortages that would, within a generation, end feudalism itself. The Great Famine didn't just kill millions, it killed the medieval world. The linguistic changes were documented by scholars. Attempting to translate pre-famine texts, the abbot of Cluny wrote, "We have 23 new words for different types of hunger, but have lost the words for feast, abundance, and satisfaction. Children learning to speak, use, eat. As past tense only, they cannot conceive of eating as a present or future action. We've developed exact terms for the taste of leather, bark, clay, but forgotten words for flavors of meat." The famine generation bore physical marks that would last lifetimes. Stunted growth, adults reaching barely 5 feet, bone deformities from childhood rickets, teeth destroyed from eating stones and wood, but worse were the invisible scars. They hoarded food obsessively, even in plenty. They ate alone in darkness, unable to share meals. They counted every grain, weighed every crumb. A physician in Paris noted, "They survived famine, but remain imprisoned by it. Their bodies live in 1322, but their minds remain in 1318. The social revolution was immediate and irreversible. A third of Europe's nobility had perished, entire bloodlines extinct. Peasants squatted in abandoned castles, worked lordless lands, claimed ownership through occupation. The survivorship created overnight social mobility, a serfhood hidden. Grain became a merchant. A baker's assistant who'd outlived his master became a guild leader. A prostitute who'd hoarded food became a property owner. The church's authority evaporated like morning frost. 7 years of unanswered prayers had broken faith's monopoly. New sects emerged, some worshipping nature, others embracing nihilism. The Pope's call for renewed devotion was met with laughter. A graffiti in Rome read, God starved. We survived. Who then is stronger? Priests found congregations unwilling to tithe, unable to trust divine providence that had provided only suffering. But most revolutionary was the labor shortage. With 15 million dead, every survivor became valuable. Peasants demanded wages. Instead of feudal obligations, serfs simply walked away from their lords, knowing they'd find better conditions elsewhere. The statute of laborers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-famine levels, was universally ignored. A blacksmith could demand noble prices. A farmer could negotiate like a merchant. The medieval world built on hierarchy. Faith and agricultural abundance had been murdered by weather. What emerged was proto-modern, mobile, skeptical, calculating. The Great Famine didn't just kill people. It killed the very idea of divinely ordered society. The survivors knew now that God could forget them, that nobles could starve, that civilization was only 3 meals deep. Europe would rebuild, but never recover. The medieval dream was frozen in those 7 years, preserved like the corpses in ice, beautiful and dead forever. In 1323, an anonymous scribe in Bavaria wrote what might be the most important document of the entire famine. Not a chronicle of events, but a warning. To those who come after, know this. We thought ourselves masters of the earth. We built castles against enemies, churches against damnation, walls against nature itself. But when the sky turned against us, when the very air became our enemy, we learned that civilization is only 3 mills deep. Beneath that lies the animal, and beneath that ... lies something worse, something that would eat its own shadow if it could provide sustenance. We survived. That is not the same as living. Some costs can never be repaid. Some hungers never leave you, no matter how much you eat. We measured time in deaths. We measured love in shared suffering. We measured God in his absence. If the cold comes again, and it will come again, remember that the greatest danger is not the freeze. It's what the freeze reveals about your neighbor, about your family, about yourself. May you never be warm enough to forget what we learned in the cold. The document was found hidden in a monastery wall, wrapped in waxed cloth, deliberately preserved. The scribe continued, I write this with fingers that consumed my own flesh. I write with eyes that watched my children choose which sibling would eat. I write with a soul that has been to hell and discovered hell is not fire. Hell is ice and the mathematics of survival. We who survived are not heroes. We are the ones who did what heroes couldn't. We chose ourselves over others. We calculated love against calories and chose calories. We learned that honor digests poorly, that mercy is a luxury of the fed, that civilization is just an agreement between people who aren't hungry yet. The sun has returned. The crops grow again. Markets open, bells ring. Children are born who will never know the taste of bark bread. They will call us the generation who endured. But endurance is just a prettier word for betrayal. Betrayal of everything we once believed. Made us human. When abundance returns, you will forget. You will must forget to stay sane. But someone should remember. Someone should know that we measured children's worth in weeks of food, that we drew lots for who would walk into winter, that we learned to distinguish the taste of different mortar. From ancient walls, so I leave this testament, not of what happened chronicles will tell that story, but of what we became. We became arithmetic. We became efficiency. We became the truth that underneath every prayer, every law, every noble sentiment, lies the animal that will eat its own tail if the circle of consumption demands it. Remember us accurately, not as victims of weather, but as humans revealed. The cold didn't change us, it showed us, and what it showed can never be fully hidden again. The thaw has come, summer returns, but we who survived carry winter inside us forever, a frozen seed that whispers, "This is what you really are, everything. Else is just the dream of well-fed men." In the spring of 1315, a mother in northern England made an unthinkable decision. She locked her children inside their cottage, walked into the frozen wasteland, and never returned. But she wasn't abandoning them. She was saving them. What she knew, what all of Europe would soon discover, was that the world itself was dying. The rain wouldn't stop. The cold wouldn't break. And for the next 7 years, winter would reign supreme. Her name was Marjorie of Dereham, and her neighbors found her children 3 days later, alive, huddled around the last embers of their fire. The eldest, a boy of 9, clutched a note his mother had left. The priest who recorded it wrote that his hands shook as he read her words aloud. "My flesh will buy them grain. My absence will grant them mercy. Tell them I walk toward God, not away from them." You see, Marjorie had understood something terrible. Something that would take the rest of Europe months to grasp. This wasn't just another harsh spring. This was the beginning of an extinction. The marketplace where she'd traded her body for bread had made the calculation clear. A living mother meant 5 mouths to feed. A missing mother meant 4 orphans the church had to shelter, and the church still had grain, still had walls, still had hope that this nightmare would end. But here's what makes Marjorie's story so haunting. She wasn't unique. Parish records from 1315 show hundreds of similar disappearances. Parents vanishing into blizzards, elderly grandparents wandering into forests, always leaving notes, always locking doors from the outside, always walking toward death like it was salvation. The chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker would later write about that spring with words that feel pulled from nightmares. The rains began on St. George's Day and fell like God had forgotten how to do anything else. Not the warm rains of April that wakes sleeping seeds, but frozen needles that killed whatever they touched. Crops didn't fail, they drowned standing. Rivers didn't flood, they exploded from their banks like wounded animals. Think about that. For a moment, you're a medieval peasant. Your entire world is 3 miles wide. Everything you know about survival, every technique your father taught you, every prayer your mother whispered, assumes one simple truth, that seasons follow patterns. Spring brings life. Summer brings growth. Autumn brings harvest. Winter brings rest. But what happens when spring never comes? When winter refuses to die? When the very foundation of existence cracks beneath your feet? That's what began in 1315. Not a famine, not a crisis, but the complete collapse of natural order. And Marjorie of Durham, walking into that frozen dawn, leaving her children behind to live, was just the first character in a story that would consume 15 million souls. Before it ended. The question isn't how Europe survived, it's what Europe became to survive it.